listening to the Mormon Renegade podcast.
Me?
Yep.
Burrito.
Yep, I think we're good. Burrito. All right, dude, you're back. Out in Nevada, running around, doing your thing. How was Nevada?
It was fine. It was just there for work. Took the opportunity to learn some new things. Wasn't too hard. Um, but anytime you get to work with people in the faith, even if it's the monotonous temporal stuff and not the spiritual stuff, it's way better.
You know, I remember I had, and this was back in my fully LDS believing days, right? Um, had an opportunity to work on a temple, a couple of them.
Okay.
And that was so much better than just doing subdivisions for developers.
No, I believe that.
Right? I mean, you just felt like you were doing something a little more worthwhile than just the run of the mill stuff. So I totally get what you're talking about there. So.
Yeah, I had a job offer to work on the Pocatello Temple, and I wish I would have taken it at the time.
Really?
Or now. Yeah, I wish I would have taken it now, but I didn't. But
well, it's all right. I hear you boys are doing stuff.
We're doing stuff.
So I mean, don't think that's just out of the question yet. So well, awesome. So we left off last time. Trying to think back, where did we leave off? We were still in the Pearl of Great Price, right? And Genesis.
Oh yeah. So we left off with our lesson with Enoch.
Yes.
And so yeah, we're in the Pearl of Great Price. We're pretty much going to get out of well, we're going to have to kind of abridge partly. We'll do some Pearl of Great Price, some more Apocrypha, and just the old-fashioned Book of Genesis for what we got, because we're dealing with Noah. And the Book of Moses kind of ends right where Noah's introduced, unfortunately.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Chapter 8.
Done.
Yeah, and then that's as far as
the
Book of Moses, goes. Although Joseph Smith did add some things, into Genesis, but
right.
It's not like additional revelatory content, except for just changing a few lines here or there.
Sure. Well, dude, that sounds good. Let's get into it.
So we left off with the city of Enoch being translated practically. In the beginning of Moses 8, we start off with, it came to pass that Methuselah, the son of Enoch, was not taken, that the covenants of the Lord might be fulfilled, which he made to Enoch, for he truly covenanted with Enoch that Noah should be of the fruit of his loins. And it came to pass that Methuselah prophesied that from his loins should spring all the kingdoms of the earth through Noah. And he took glory unto himself. So yeah, we see in the Pearl of Great Price, Enoch, during his ascension, he is showed visions of the future. He sees Noah. He knows what's going to happen. It's been prophesied. And so Methuselah is left as a remnant. And Methuselah's son is Lamech, and Lamech's son is Noah. Noah is born 4 years after the city of Enoch was translated.
Ooh.
So Lamech was already there. He was already born and would have known Enoch.
Right.
And yeah, all the other patriarchs.
That's kind of crazy, right? Because in Noah must have, just been raised with these stories, right? Mm-hmm. About Enoch, right? And it makes me also wonder, what kind of influence that was on Noah, right?
So
as he
you have the stories, but you'd also, I believe, if these guys weren't taken, but the chronology in the patriarchs makes it seem like it's not when you do the graphs and you can see the time, the lifespan. Noah would have known Enos, son of Seth, grandson of Adam, for 100 years or so,
right,
of his life or whatever. I don't have that figure, but he would have known firsthand his fifth, sixth great grandpa. Because Noah's 10, so it'd be 7 generations from Enos.
Okay,
so his 7th great grandpa.
And then it makes me wonder too if like the prophecies of Enoch concerning Noah were around while Noah was coming up.
Oh, that would be a weird thing,
right? But it's possible, right? Given the time.
Well, it would be given what you're putting. That's something I've not thought about, but that's
How weird would that have
That's
been?
almost too much for anyone to handle, I
A
would
lot to
say.
live up to,
It
right?
is. It is.
That's why I always thought when like Hispanic people name their kids Jesus, I'm like, that's a lot to live
That's
up to, right?
that's a lot to live up to.
And then
Absolutely.
all of a sudden, but imagine having like prophecies about you, right? And I'm always interested to get inside the minds. I mean, we're never going to be able to until I cross over and I pray I get an audience with some of them. But even Joseph Smith, right? As he's, reading stuff about, and from the, loins of Joseph will come another with that same name, right?
Right.
And then like I can only imagine translating and being like, what the hell, right? And
Yeah.
then
Yeah. Yeah.
the fact that that doesn't mess with somebody's head is pretty interesting.
Yeah. It's possible maybe that it was veiled in a certain manner. Like, let's say we take the view that Noah maybe was a new name once he took the mantle.
Right,
And so maybe it wasn't uh such a burden on his formative development.
right,
If like Melchizedek's a title, right? Kind of a
right,
thing. And Christ became the high priest after the order of Melchizedek, but it's all types and shadows.
right.
That could be maybe a safeguard to the psyche,
Yeah,
if something like that was going on. But otherwise, that's
it'd be a head
I
trick,
know
right?
I wouldn't want that.
No, no, because you're like, well, so much for just becoming a carpenter, right? I
Yeah,
mean, like
or
that's
yeah,
out.
and we see what happens with people who are raised with silver spoons or whatever religious equivalent. You end up with Messiah or God complexes,
Yeah,
negatively,
I would think it would have had to have been kept from him, right?
or something. Yeah, I would.
Because at some level, it'd make you kind of a nihilist, wouldn't it? I mean, if you knew, especially Noah, right? Especially Noah, because like, and I'm sure we'll get into. Are we going to get all the way to the ark story today?
Oh yeah, easy.
Okay, I'll save that for a little later, but that's something that I definitely want to check out. Hold on one second here, Michael.
Oh, you're good. You're good.
I'll just pause. Yeah, so there's some stuff I definitely want to talk about towards the end of Noah's life that I think is will show his humanity in a way that I don't think many people have stopped to think about.
Okay,
But we'll get
sure.
there.
Yeah, that could be fun. So Enoch's translated, leaving Methuselah. Well, according to the chronology, other patriarchs are still around if they didn't get lifted up. But according to Second Enoch, let's call. I took to calling these pseudo Enoch
Hmm.
in the classes, because it's the pseudepigrapha, right?
Right.
And their books attributed to Enoch, but seem, with the possible exception, or maybe even seeming exception, of what the scholars call First Enoch, which seems to be on brass plates, stuff in the Book of Mormon, as we covered last time, right? So that puts it back before 600 BC. But Second Enoch seems to be around the time of Christ, uh, as far as it being produced. Second Enoch, chapter 68, has Methuselah and his children building an altar or a temple at the site that Enoch was translated, which I thought was interesting.
That
And
is interesting, but that fits.
if it fits, and Methuselah becomes the acting leader and king and a priest over the people that were God's covenant people at this point
Makes
in time.
sense as well. Yeah.
And they're praying and they're asking for revelation, and Methuselah is there, and they all circle up around the altar, and he's the leader. He's the guy praying and acting as Adam, essentially.
Right.
Right? It doesn't say that, but you know, and
Yeah.
I know what we're talking about
Yep.
there.
Absolutely. Yep.
But yeah, so it says, even, it says that they dress him as a king with beautiful garments, and they pray at the altar. And so, not to me, it's not just fascinating that, oh, they're building an altar in a temple. Uh, it's it seems, if it's true, that the pseudo Enoch, second Enoch, was produced within 200 years of Christ. it becomes an interesting social commentary on the time.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in this Enoch literature, you have almost like it's a polemic against the priesthood of the day
Mm,
in Jerusalem, with the
right.
Levites, and the emphasis on Moses being the lawgiver. We see that all the time through the scriptures because we see in the Enoch literature descriptors that Enoch gets the Torah first,
Right.
divinely, and he's like the celestial traveler, and he goes and he's the scribe and he gets it and he brings it back down. So it's almost like you could see, and we know or we assume that the Enoch literature was popular with like these outcast groups that are
Okay.
against the established priesthood body in the city, and you could see that it's advantageous for these other groups to say we have a priesthood tradition that antedates or predates Moses getting the law and
That's
establishing the priesthood.
interesting.
So it's a higher claim, is what they're making.
Right.
And by claiming the temple, a temple there, like that's what they're laying claim to essentially. Is like you have undercurrents essentially that I'm spelling out here for us, right?
Right.
Is that these people around the time of Christ, some of them, not all of them, we know the Jews were looking for the Romans to be overthrown politically,
Yep.
but there was subsets that were waiting for the temple to be overthrown because it was apostate.
Interesting.
Where
Now,
there,
who were these groups?
among them could be the Essenes, or
Okay.
but for the if they're identified with the Qumran community, then which some people are not willing to say 100% whether
Okay.
that's identical, right?
Right.
But so Qumran and the Essenes and possibly others, right?
Okay. And they would have had the Enoch literature,
Yeah, it was
right?
very popular. Yeah,
Now, what about Ethiopia? Would they have had that at that time as well?
probably not. We call the Ethiopian Enoch, which is first Enoch,
Right.
because Christianity eventually took that down there
Right.
later.
Okay.
But it was definitely written in Hebrew first
Okay.
because we found fragments
All
of
right.
Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew or Aramaic. And so the scholarly consensus is first Enoch, which, as we determined, was on the brass plates,
Yep.
right, last
Yep.
time. Went from, well, maybe even something that was before Hebrew to Greek to Ethiopian.
Okay. The only reason I asked about Ethiopia is there's that legend that that's where the Ark of the Covenant wound
Right.
up,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I wonder if maybe some of those records didn't travel down there at that time, but if the consensus is it comes through Christianity and not Hebrewism, then Judaism, then that makes sense too.
Well, I could look into that, but yeah, I mean, it's the Ethiopian church that's a Christian church that has the Book of Enoch. I don't know if there's any
Okay.
Ethiopian Jewish traditions that have the Book of Enoch in Ethiopia. I could be wrong.
Okay. No, no, it's good. I was just curious.
And so that time period is super interesting because you do have this overlap of Christianity and Judaism that are all doing their own thing. And
Right.
people just think we were Jews and then the Christianity was next.
No,
Sometimes that's what we
no,
think of it. It was not that way
no, there was
at
a
all.
lot of bleed over,
And a
right?
lot of weird things in the middle and outside this intersection and everything.
People forget there was a debate going on between Paul and Peter, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah,
hey, these guys got to go get snipped first, right?
yeah,
Before they can become Christians, right? And I
yeah.
mean, there's some stuff there going on that I think people just think, oh, they got a charge from Jesus and they had it all figured out, and here we go. And that's not necessarily the case at all.
Right. And so in this, the Secrets of Enoch, which is second Enoch, you have this emphasis on Enoch as the high priest over Moses, over Aaron. Um, you also have Melchizedek type
Right.
themes, which this is really prepping the people for, and really emphasizing that there's an order of the priesthood that's higher than what the Levites got. This
Right.
priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, and then when Christianity comes along, they kind of say that guy, that Enoch, this Enoch literature that we've had been talking about, yeah, that was Christ that was crucified. And then that got the Jews all like, okay, we're not going to use Enoch anymore.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, there's a political,
Yeah.
and that's just it, right? Is that our Western way of thought is to separate religion and religion and politics,
Uh-huh.
right? Especially from the American standpoint. Now, I want to say, I don't think the founders ever really envisioned that. I think we look at the separation of church and state as being one of those things that's for the state, right? But actually, the founders understood it. No, you're protecting religion from the state.
Yes.
And so what's very interesting is that you do have a commingling of the political authority until the Romans and whoever else conquered them before, the Greeks and that sort of thing. It was a theocracy, right?
Right.
It was ruled by essentially clerics of the time.
Right. So yeah, I think that's just interesting stuff to set the stage for us. So Noah, according to the Doctrine and Covenants, now this is what Noah was ordained the priesthood when he was 10 years old by Methuselah. Yeah.
Well, didn't they have a handbook of instructions to tell them that that wasn't right?
They had all this other scripture. I guess they were too busy reading that instead of the handbook.
Instead of the handbook. My bad. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's interesting. But then again, like John was ordained to like as a baby,
Yeah,
preparatory to his calling.
there's some stuff there, right? That makes you wonder. And we do see some instances of this even in Brigham Young's day, right? Because he ordained his sons to the apostleship.
He ordained John Willard, I believe, when he was 13 years old as an apostle.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where I don't think that's always out of the realm of improbability, right? And I often wonder what does that look like for the kid, right? Are those keys held in like escrow, right? Like sort of a
Yeah, because are you going to trust a 13?
yeah, you're gonna trust a 13-year-old?
Yeah.
Now, I want to say that life was different back then, right?
Right.
Like you were sent out to herd sheep at 8, and you
Yeah.
better be able to fend off the wolves while you're there, right? So
Yeah.
they aren't your typical, young kids, but still, I mean, it often makes me wonder what that looked like.
I think so too. Yeah, that's a good point. So he's ordained when he was 10, but around 500 years of age, Noah was ordained again by the Lord. It says in Moses 8, verse 19. He was ordained by the Lord after his own order. And so that's interesting. What do you think about that?
After his own order. I would think that would be, if you were to put it in today's terms, is that the calling and election made sure?
Yeah, I think that's tied together with
Right. I think that's what it's referring to there if I was a betting man.
Right.
But that's where I'd go with it.
Yeah. It's essentially what it is. I think that yeah, it's the fullness of this king and priesthood,
Right.
and you also see something interesting along these lines too, perhaps with it's also is it in section? I don't think it's section. It's section 84, where it says Isaias was ordained of God to the priesthood.
Okay.
And he lived in the days of Abraham. You remember that
Mhm.
passage?
Yep.
Right. So you do have this occasional ordaining of God. And so theories are it's also the stuff like you now have the keys to act. Like I would say it's beyond calling an election made sure in the sense that it seems that we see people who are ordained after this order begin to have powers. Like Nephi, son of Helaman,
Yep.
Elijah, Enoch, and the Joseph Smith translation of the book of Genesis 9 or whatever says that this is you have faith to break mountains, to change the course of rivers, to defy armies and nations, and or as God says to Moses, the waters will obey you as if you were God. As he says to Nephi, you will not anything you ask, I will do because I know that you will not ask amiss.
Right.
It's this higher level. Elijah calling down fire on the priests of Baal,
Right.
or on the sacrifice, and then on other people.
That's when things get real,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you this question. We know that one of the things that's supposed to happen when your calling election made sure is that the Savior appears to you, right?
I think that's the way I think.
Okay. And that there could be some hands laid upon you.
That's what I tend to think.
Who is it if Christ has not been embodied yet?
Great question.
I got theories,
Yeah,
but they're
theories.
just theories.
Are we gonna say since you're gonna edit it out, or
I think it's Adam. I think it's God the Father.
okay?
I think he shows up at that point before Christ
Yeah,
and lays hands on heads.
or it'll be the previous Jehovah
The previous
while
Jehovah.
Adam's
Yeah.
immortality. That's where I was gonna go with that.
Yep.
But the Jehovah Christ, in the words of Joseph Musser.
Yes. Yep. Yep. And so, yeah, I don't know, dude. That was one of those questions that I've always had when I read that. After I discovered what the second anointing was, that sort of thing. Those were questions I had. Well, then who's showing up to
Oh yeah, before
Abraham? Who's
yeah,
showing up
exactly.
to Noah? Right?
Can't be Christ.
Can't be Christ. He's not embodied yet.
That's right.
So just questions.
Yeah. No, well, these things they have to stand up to scrutiny on that level. And unless you're going to go out there with things that I consider weird, and saying that, that Christ was embodied previously, you can't slice. Yeah, it's the only way you could go. But that brings up a whole
More moral probation. Whew, sorry.
Yeah, it brings up a whole slew of things that are also more problematic.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. It's gotta maintain that order. So
Uh, you ever think that Noah was a polygamist?
I do.
Why do you think that?
Because of some of his kids.
Yeah, it talks about so yeah, it says something. It's kind of like this little Easter egg that probably many people, I bet you most of our people probably picked up on this, but other people might not. Which is kind of fun with the current undercurrents of the anti-polygamy debate because it just keeps popping up with these ancient patriarchs. Abraham had 2 wives. Jacob had 4 wives.
Right.
Lehi seems to maybe have been married to Ishmael's wife after Ishmael dies because it says Jacob and Joseph may have had a different mother than Nephi, Sam, and
Right.
Lemuel. But then you get this passage in the Pearl of Great Price in the Book of Moses, revealed in this part probably in 1831, saying, "And Noah was 450 years old and begat Japheth, and 42 years afterwards he begat Shem, of her who was the mother of Japheth. And when he was 500 years old, he begat Ham. And Noah and his sons hearkened unto the Lord and gave heed, and they were called the sons of God." And so that makes a distinction
Yeah.
that Shem and Japheth were full brothers for some reason. It wants to make that distinction.
Yeah. And there's no reason to do that if he's a monogamist.
And there's no reason to do that if Ham had the same mom as Shem and Japheth.
Right. It just doesn't make sense. Right.
Makes zero sense.
And again, that one kind of blows apart their argument, right? Because oftentimes the polygamy deniers will say things like, well, every time it's tried, it goes bad, right? Well, doesn't seem to be this time, right? There's no mention of any dysfunction inside Noah's family.
Sure. Right.
Seems pretty copacetic.
Yeah, and even I can't think of another reason that it would be there. For example, maybe a defender of the anti-polygamy narrative could say, "Oh, well, you're assuming he's a polygamist. Maybe he had these wives sequentially and not concurrently. Maybe one of his wives died and then he
Right.
remarried." Then why mention it? I don't know. Why is that important unless it's an Easter egg for questions for Joseph Smith to be asking about?
Right. Absolutely. It's one, yeah. And again, as early as 1831.
Right. Yes.
Right. This is obviously,
Which, according to some sources, that's when he got the revelation
yeah.
for D&C 132 or the prototype of it.
Right. Yeah, when he's like, no, thanks for offering, but no, we will not be doing that. And then it has to get a little more firm from there. So, no, that's interesting. That's good stuff.
And so we talked about the Watcher thing, right?
And we determined that those were like the rock creatures from the movie
Man.
Noah, right? I mean,
yeah.
That's what those
I mean,
those were.
you gotta explain the biology problem of how to have
Right.
offspring, though. No, with that, but so yeah, these fallen angels. It seems if you read the Hugh Nibley stuff on it, they're coming to mirror the social order of the priesthood by giving away ordinances and things like that. They're imitating the order of God, but they're also doing it to propagate their own species. Maybe because they fell into the class of angels that is described in Z&C 132, where they had no right to perpetual increase.
Right.
That could be a motivation. I've heard that explanation. And anyway, so they marry the daughters of men, and problems happen after that. But you see like a reversal in the narrative in our book of Moses. In chapter 8, it says, and when these men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and this is after Noah. So it says Noah's sons were called the sons of God. And it says, these men began to multiply upon the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. And the sons of men saw that those daughters, so the daughters of the sons of God,
Okay.
were fair, and took them wives even as they chose. And the Lord said unto Noah, the daughters of thy sons have sold themselves. For behold, mine anger is kindled against the sons of men, for they will not hearken unto my voice.
Mm.
So you have the flip flop of what happened
Yeah.
to the previous generation with Enoch,
Yeah, you do.
with the sons of God being the angels coming to the not righteous daughters of men, but now it's the daughters of the sons of God, of the righteous sons of God, marrying infidels.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that?
I don't know. I just think it's interesting that there's an inverse of the paradigm later.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting.
I mean, I think covenant marriage ultimately is super important to the Lord, but that's like the easiest
It
way to
sure
look at
seems to
that.
be, right? I mean, look, there's a reason Abraham is like sending his servant out to look.
Yep.
And what's interesting is that Abraham gives that guy kind of a token to know who it is, right? And
Yeah.
so that tells me that there's certain traits that, probably because of the priesthood, right? The presence of the priesthood that, you know, are going to make people recognizable. And that comes through covenant marriage. It's important.
Hmm. But continuing, we have things. The very little it says in the book of Moses about Noah. It says Noah prophesied. He taught the things of God, even as it was in the beginning. But then it closes, or not closes, but it talks about verse 27 of chapter 8. It says that Noah walked with God. That's like Enoch, right?
Hmm.
He's attained at the same level. And it also says, as did his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Okay, so they're all walking. They've all apparently been
They,
ordained.
yeah, they've made the grade to a point where they're able to be in the rest of the
Whew.
Lord while in mortality.
Right. Man.
So, yeah, pretty phenomenal, I think. And not emphasized, maybe it's not recognized, or maybe it's not emphasized just because there's not much more detail on it besides that, which is
Right.
fair. In the back to our first book of Enoch, the Ethiopian version, though, because there's Noah stuff in that. There's
Right.
not so much. There's a little bit in second Enoch, but there's more Noah stuff in first Enoch.
Okay.
Um, in first Enoch chapter 60, we see Noah has a vision or dialogue with the Ancient of Days,
Okay.
and he's starting to get like this is like the prelude to like the flood.
Right.
And in fact, Enoch talks to the Ancient of Days in another place, and it says that the Ancient of Days was the one that sends the flood too. So I mean
Right.
that stands to
That's
reason.
yeah, there's another Adam God
Right,
connection.
because well, every other religion also understands that the Ancient of Days is God, you
Right.
know. And so Noah has dialogue with the Ancient of Days, and without much transition or segue, Michael the Archangel also in like the same chapter,
Right.
which is interesting. But and Michael the Archangel tells him concerning the judgments coming upon the earth. And then Enoch also comes down to Noah during all this, and Noah's praying at an altar with his hands outstretched, and Enoch comes down and begins to kind of prep Noah for the flood and tells him that the reason is because the angels have revealed the secrets. Uh, Sometimes you read the scripture and it says it's like, okay, the secrets may have been stuff like, oh, the watchers taught the children of men how to commit war and build instruments of war, or taught the ladies how to make makeup. But Hugh Nibley, in a lot of his commentary and stuff, he's like pretty adamant that and it does get, it does say this in other places too, but it's the main thing was it was ordinances.
Right.
The angels were revealing the knowledge that they had received from the heavens. And I don't, coming from where I'm coming from, and probably where you're coming from, I don't think the heavens are super, super, super concerned about makeup and
No,
cosmetics.
no,
And
no,
and
no. And to be honest with you, I don't even think that the Lord is necessarily that worried about weapons of war.
well,
Right.
well, it says in the Old Testament that he's a god of war
Right.
at times.
Right. And has to be, right. And I was
Yeah,
just going there for the self-defense of his people,
yeah.
right? I would think that that would be one of those things. He's like, oh, they should probably have that, right? Probably know how to stand up against some of this.
And the reason why some of that I think is in the books of Enoch is because that's more of they're trying to tie this angel thing, the falling of the angels, into basically being what the fall of mankind was more than Adam and Eve eating the fruit of the garden
Right.
being the catalyst. And so they need to describe and attribute all the woes of the human condition to the angels. The advent of these angels coming down is what I think is happening. But it's interesting, it's circumventing the
Yeah.
sin of Eden,
It is.
you
Yep.
know, sin in quotations, because I don't think that was a sin whatsoever. It was all part of the plan,
Right.
right? As we know. But the blame's got to go somewhere in you know, these things. And the more I read of these things, I'm not super nitpicky on chronology or certain details because there's many different apocryphal books and other things that were considered scripture and holy. And as I reviewed them, they got merits. Hugh Nibley would say details can be scrambled, but the motifs are always present,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Right. The overarching theme is always there,
Yeah,
but the details,
can be scrambled.
right. That
And
makes
that's
sense.
just fine, right? If you know your scriptures and the standard words,
Right.
right? And yeah, then you're pretty good. Do you have any more comments so
Nope.
far? Okay. So yeah, the Noah's talking with Enoch. Enoch says that because they revealed the ordinances, this whole generation's got to be destroyed, and they have no place of repentance forever, because they have shown them what is hidden, and they are damned. It's pretty hardcore language. But as for thee, my son, the Lord of spirits knows that thou art pure and guiltless of this reproach concerning the secrets. And he has destined thy name to be among the holy, and will preserve thee among those who dwell on the earth, and has destined thy righteous seed for both kingship and for great honors. And from thy seed shall proceed a fountain of the righteous and the holy without number forever. And then he's shown by Enoch that angels are building the ark, which that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, angels are building it in that
Well,
scenario.
yeah, if you read some of those early pioneer accounts, right, where they talk about looking back, expecting to see somebody pushing the handcart
Yeah.
while they're pulling, right? I don't think that's necessarily out of the realm of not just possibility, but likelihood.
Well, there's another thought that just came to my mind too. As I've been watching some stuff with the Stick of Joseph podcast, they're really doing a good work in the church. And the Old Testament stuff that they've been doing, Dave Butler talks about how sometimes in veiled terms, priests and angels are synonymous terms. Have you
Okay.
caught on to any of that yet?
No,
'Cause
no.
I know you're reading in the language of Adam right
Right.
now, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know if he goes into that in the book, but in the podcasts, he talks about how
Okay.
sometimes angels and priests in the scriptures
Are the same.
angels are priests. He says
Right.
sometimes. So it could be a priesthood order that's
Right.
building the ark,
No,
right?
that's a good point too. Yeah.
Which hold on to that thought.
Okay.
But do you have a comment?
Well, yeah, and you can tell me, hey, we're going to cover that later. But if it's If it's a priesthood thing, right? I only see two options there, right? One is maybe it's his sons, right?
Okay.
Noah's sons.
Yeah.
But if it's not, that means some priesthood most likely died in the flood, or there's people on the ark that the book doesn't tell us about.
Those are all certainly possibilities, I think, because I'm not the one to take it to the literal point of there was just 8 men
Right.
or 4 men and 4 women.
No.
Because I think some things just have to be symbolic. Although I will say on the podcast, if someone were to ask me if I view a worldwide flood or a localized flood, I'm more in the camp for the worldwide personally.
I am too.
And so don't just think that I'm like a guy fitting it into the scriptures into modernism when I say I don't believe eight people.
You're from Washington, right?
Yeah, and Montana, pretty
Okay.
evenly split.
Do you ever visit the Washington Scablands?
No, if I have, I didn't know by that term. What's that?
I believe it's in eastern Washington.
Okay, so I grew up on Puget Sound, but
All right. So in eastern Washington, there's what's called the Washington Scablands,
okay,
and it looks like a scab. I mean, there are potholes, massive potholes, and you can look in these potholes and you can see swirls,
okay,
right? And forever, they're like, well, we're not entirely sure. Maybe volcanic activity, something like that. Only there's not volcanic rock,
okay, sure.
right? So now you're like, okay, so what is this?
Doesn't fit. Yeah,
Well, when you start digging into it, it comes basically this flood, all the flood myths, and then when you find corresponding evidence, it all happens around the same time.
yeah, that's pretty.
And
Yeah.
what's interesting is that it's also a time in which when they rewind the clock, so to speak, with computers and stuff, and this was just recent. I want to say this was in the last 10 or 15 years, where they have the software to take it back. The Earth passes through the Toward meteor stream.
Okay.
And basically, one hypothesis is that asteroids hit the Florentine ice shelf and it releases a massive amount of water
Sure.
into the earth, right? But we see massive evidence of this all over the place, where there seems to be a cataclysmic kind of global flood that absolutely changes the landscape.
Well, and all the ancient cultures have it's ubiquitous. This
Yes.
mythology of the global flood is everywhere.
Yep. And then the other thing is that there is, some revision going on now with the Grand Canyon, right? Because for so long it was just millions of years because of the Colorado River. But now they're going, well, that doesn't make sense if we look at some of the strata, right? This seems to be a cataclysmic kind of flood that does this in fairly short order.
Sure.
So now, in full disclosure, I'm not a young Earth creationist though either.
Nor am
I can't get behind that. I mean, I've tried to wrap my mind around it, but the evidence just keeps popping back up, and it's hard to wrap your mind around.
Yeah.
So
I think the other alternatives to young Earth creationism are far more interesting, anyways.
right, yeah,
Because the knee-jerk reaction though is like, okay, people would say, I'm worried you're wresting the scriptures, or this has other questions with the restoration. Things like, well, how could that work if it says the scripture, our restoration scriptures says that Adam was the first flesh upon the earth, and I think that there are answers to those questions that are faithful and enlightening without being
right.
We're trying to wrest this into this modern,
No.
this modern scientific modernism that's like we can take away this I don't know, mystical element is more
Right.
natural.
Right. And see, the other thing I'll say on this is that if you're an adherent to the restoration, well, you have extra canonical sources, right, that carry just as much weight. And I go back to the account that Joseph speaking in Nauvoo, where he says, we speak of a world, but the world is different than a
planet or
than a planet or an earth, right? A world talks about the inhabitants of a people.
Yeah.
And in some of those same accounts, he says the earth's been inhabited 7 times before, right? Which is a very interesting idea,
Yeah, there's
right?
also one statement that's also, I think it's in the history of the church, but it's scrubbed. But the original has Hiram Smith talking in Nauvoo and says that there was prophets before Adam,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
which
there's,
is weird. Where to
yeah.
put that?
Yeah, how do you deal with that, right? And so I don't necessarily subscribe to the young earth model. Now,
I don't either.
let me say this. I think you can make a reasonable argument that maybe the clock starts again when Adam comes to earth,
Oh yeah,
right?
that's how I feel like it is. But it's just like Noah restarting the clock after the
Right.
flood, which is exactly what we're because
Right.
Noah is the type
Yes.
of Adam
Yes.
restarting the world, right? But that makes you wonder about Adam being a type for Noah
Yeah.
coming from another world.
Yep.
Just like Noah, Noah is traversing the old world to the new world.
Yep.
Adam, as God, and as an archangel, as a resurrected being, is transversing the old world to a new world.
Yep. Yep.
But it
And
also doesn't mean that there weren't people here before him.
right, right. And right down to the endowment, if you pay attention to the liturgy, makes you wonder about certain things the adversary says at the beginning,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
absolutely. It sure does. We have a new world here.
Yep.
All right. Which is still in there, the endowment. And that was probably one of the most fun things to me when I first got my endowment in the LDS church to see that was stuff that you weren't really, and it's still this way, I'm sure, you're discouraged to talk about in Sunday school. But here it was, right on the big screen.
Right. Yep.
But then you're still not allowed to.
You're still not allowed to talk about it. No.
But here we are talking about it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Renegade.
that's right.
So,
You have any more
nope,
questions?
that's it.
Okay. So another motif, we did touch about it a little bit, but it's consistent throughout not just the Enoch literature, it's in the Adam literature that we talked about a long time ago. But in First Enoch 68, Noah, and before the flood, Noah gets the books of the secrets, all
Okay.
this knowledge from Enoch. Enoch's
Right.
already been translated, as we put it in our terms, right?
Right.
He's ascended into the heavens. He's been the scribe of the angels and of God. And the world's about to be destroyed, and boom, Enoch comes and passes this knowledge to Noah.
Right.
Uh, it says, what does it say here? Anyways, so yeah, he gets those books. The Adam literature said, uh, or our literature says Adam was keeping a record, the Book of Remembrance, and he passed it down. The Adam literature said that Seth started a record, and it also says that it made it to Enoch, and that
Mm.
Enoch passed it down, and it was to end up in the Temple of Solomon, right? Do you recall any of that?
Yep.
So these motifs of the record being passed down are consistent. So Noah carries this through the flood, right? The Book of Jubilees, which is also given a code name, Little Genesis in some circles, says in chapter 10 that Noah wrote down in a book everything. And he gave all the books that he had written to his oldest son Shem, because he loved him much more than all of his other sons. And then the book of Abraham, back in our Pearl of Great Price, says, I shall endeavor hereafter to delineate the chronology, running back from myself to the beginning of the creation. For the records have come into mine hands, which I hold unto this present time. And I, Abraham, had the Urim and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given unto me in Ur of the Chaldees, or Chaldees.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a transition of these books and records and scriptures
Right.
all the way down from Adam through the flood, through Noah, down to Abraham, which I just found it incredibly consistent.
Yeah.
Down to the fact that after a confusion of languages, Abraham needs the Urim and Thummim to be able to translate it,
Yeah.
to read it, right? Otherwise, what's the point in them having the Urim and Thummim?
And that's one of those continuity things that adds credence to the gospel narrative,
Yeah,
right? When you find incoherencies or incongruities, I'm not saying you should ever just throw things out because of that, but so often I think you can find those, which just adds to the validity of the account.
I think so too. And when you see multiple things, multiple accounts, it's like the Gospels. The Gospels in the New Testament are not 100%
No,
synchronized
no,
at all.
nor should we expect them to be.
And it's the same with other scripture too, sometimes.
Yeah.
We shouldn't always expect, like Hugh Nibley says, details can be scrambled, but the motifs are clear.
Well, I have a friend who's a detective, and he said the biggest red flag is when two people's stories are too identical.
Right.
He's like, that
It's
doesn't
rehearsed.
happen. Yeah, it's
It's
rehearsed,
a
right?
conspiracy.
When you go to an accident scene and you get reports of everybody, things are a little different, right? But you again get the overall motif.
Absolutely. And then we're getting into the really nerdy stuff now. Let's
Nice.
talk about biblical source criticisms before we
Nice.
continue on. Do you know what I mean by that?
No, why don't you explain that?
We have talked about the documentary hypothesis in
Mm-hmm.
class,
Yep.
probably on this podcast before. I was really sold on it by the boys at the Stick of Joseph. Um, Again, I don't want people thinking I'm just like into this modern scholarly stuff as far as narratives that like because I don't take it to the point of oh scripture's not real. I believe the gospel's real. I
I
believe
do
scriptures
too.
are real too. But sometimes scriptures are written as scripture and not history,
Right.
and there's different audiences.
Well, yeah.
Like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Back to that. Like Matthew was written for Hebrews, and Mark was written for Hebrews, and Luke was written for the Gentiles.
Right.
You know,
Tailoring the to
the
the audience.
exactly,
Yep.
exactly, absolutely.
Yep. And so we're gonna get into some of that now.
Well, okay, so we have this. Well, so Noah was a long time ago,
Right.
a long, long time ago, because you got the myth of this flood in every nation, every tongue, and people on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long time ago. Even Moses purportedly writing the Torah will be a long time ago. That's over 3,000 years ago. Israel being a nation after Moses, like under the monarchy, 400 years after Moses is 3,000 years ago.
Right.
This is a long time. But then they have you political differences, like we talked about
Mm-hmm.
earlier. Like we see at the time of Christ, you got all these different sectarian groups, Christian, Jewish, and others. You have a division as soon as Solomon dies of the United Kingdom,
Right.
and there's two political kingdoms now, the North and the South.
Right.
Some people have used the American North and South to illustrate how history can be different.
Mm-hmm.
Because what is the Civil War down south?
Well, I can tell you this. So you're in okay. Tangent time. Tangent time. Okay. So it was when I was living in Maryland. And Maryland's a funny state because it's not fully the North, but yet it's not the South
Uh-huh.
either, right? It's a weird in between. And it was even reflected in where they would put POWs just across the border in Fort Delaware. So, like, they put like Confederate POWs there, some of them being generals.
Uh-huh.
Now, the Union officers, the Union generals who were over that particular fort where the Confederate generals were being housed, told all of their soldiers, his soldiers, to be like, when those Confederate soldiers step out in the morning, you still salute them.
Uh-huh.
Right. It was so that just illustrates that Delmarva Peninsula area
Uh-huh.
is a really mixed bag,
Right.
right?
Well, it's super close to Virginia right
Yes.
there. It
Yes.
makes sense.
But then it's just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Philadelphia, which is blatantly north, right?
Yankees.
Right. And so it's a weird little state. And I remember we got sent down to a place called Pocomoke, Virginia, to do a
Okay.
survey. And or maybe it was across the Chesapeake. Crap, I can't remember now. It may have been on the west side of the Chesapeake, so don't quote me on the exact region, but we were in Virginia. And we had to go out and do a survey for an old guy. And I mean, he'd been on that land his whole life. His granddad had been out there his whole life. And um they end up we end up talking to him because you always talk to the homeowner because they usually have something, hey, I know a pin that's over here that you can start with and on and on. So I'm getting the rundown from the old guy, and he goes, "Yes, sir. And I've been on this land. My family's been on this land since the War of Northern Unpleasantry."
Yeah.
Right. I'm like, we should probably let this go, right? Like, we might be to the point where it's time to let it go. But yeah, I mean, there's definite carryover
So
from that.
I haven't heard that exact term, but yeah, War of Northern Aggression and there's
Hmm.
other derivatives I've heard too. But yeah, it's different history, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Despite the
absolutely.
fact that the unified history books in public schools down south will say Civil War, in your family, it's the War of Northern Unpleasantry, right?
Right. Yep. Yep.
And that's just the way it is. And the South will rise again,
Yes,
right?
that's the other thing, right? And I
Yes.
heard that a lot too, right? Now I want to be clear. There was nothing more satisfying to me than seeing some liberal from like Vermont, some Ben and Jerry's eating Birkenstock wearing guy come down into Southern Virginia because
Oh,
he stuck out like a sore thumb. I mean, it was, and he knew it too, right? I mean, there were times I used to enjoy watching that. But dude, that's still there, right?
have you seen any Confederate flags down here since you moved here
Here?
in
No,
Missouri?
not in Missouri. No, I haven't.
Around where I live, you'll if you go around, you'll see some.
The old bars and stars.
Oh yeah, well not the bars. No, the battle flag with
Yeah,
the yeah
yeah, the bars and stars, right? The blue and the stars in the middle of the bars.
yeah.
So when I was in Virginia, they said they called orange and blue, and they called that the bars and stars.
I thought that was the national flag for the Confederacy because the
That was
battle
the
flag
stars
was
and
the
stripes. For the Union,
Stars and Stripes for the Union, right? What we call ours today.
and then the bars and stars for the Confederacy, because you had the blue bars that crisscrossed and
Yeah,
formed that
that's
X.
yeah,
So they called it the bars, and then
yeah,
the stars were in the middle
yeah. But you'll
of the
see
bars.
that. I've seen that more than any other time in my life in the last 3.5 years I've been here.
Really, it's still they're still around,
Oh
huh?
yeah, they're
I've
around.
always said since they kind of went super woke, if you have that flag, look, you might want to pick that up just for posterity's sake, right?
Yeah,
Because for years from now they'll be asking what
dude.
that is.
I remember. Shoot, when was it? I think it was right before the George Floyd thing.
Uh-huh.
I was seeing shirts in the mall in Washington State with a Confederate flag
Oh yeah.
on it. In the mall, in like hipster
Oh
like
yeah.
stores. And then they were pulled right now.
Yeah.
Right
Oh.
now, and I've never seen them since.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it went hard and fast, right? I mean, after that whole thing went down, it was and see, look, I'm not a fan of that. I'm glad the North won, right?
Oh,
Like
sure, dude. Yeah,
I,
totally. I'm
I'm
with
I'm
you.
glad the North won. However, let's not just erase history,
That's
right?
well, as a historian, I have to agree with you
Let's
vehemently.
yeah, let's not get rid of that because there's things there that we want to learn from, right? And I think it can be a cautionary tale to us. This is what happens when we don't listen to other people, right? Um, and I look at the Civil War and I think it is the result of a failure to communicate. I also think it could be, I'm a shelve that. I would get in trouble for that. Well, what the hell? I think it could have been divine retribution to not walking up to our principles, no matter how you feel about the priesthood ban,
Well,
right?
or it's the way I've always kind of viewed it is it's retribution to the government in general for how they treated the gospel, the restoration of the gospel.
That's it too. And people get real uncomfortable when they start saying, the 14th Amendment was crap. And I'm like, well, it may not have turned out quite like you had hoped, but if you read Joseph Smith and what he's asking for the 14th Amendment. Everything that he asks for is later ratified with the 14th Amendment.
Right.
You just yeah. So I mean there's some play there for sure that I often get in trouble with even with my own people for bringing up, but it's just kind of the where I see the conflict lie. Um because absolutely the question was in Joseph Smith's time is can the federal government come in and get redress for people who'd been wronged by their states, right? It's kind of the same question with the slave population, right? If they are people,
Hmm.
does this apply, right? And the same question was asked about the Mormons.
That's a fair point. So, yes. So the documentary hypothesis. the analogy of the North and the South in our history is really helpful because among the Israelites, you had the northern and southern kingdoms. The North was led by Ephraim, the South by Judah,
Hmm.
essentially, right? North was
Yep.
bigger, the 10 tribes versus like three and a half, depending on how way you slice it in the South. Because really there's 13 tribes,
Right.
and Levi's weird because they didn't have their own inheritance. And so you have Levites throughout, but a big portion of the Levites, Benjamin, uh, and Judah, essentially
Right.
end up being together, right? Well, and they go to war with each other too. So,
Yep.
at times, and things cool off, but at first they were not on good terms. And the Lord was trying to work with the northern kingdom and establish prophets there and kings there. And it seems like things were messed up pretty early on. Although part of me wonders if the story we aren't told isn't different because now we're dealing with this propaganda machine.
We
Because where
are.
does where does our scriptures come from? The South,
Yep.
generally.
Yep.
Now the answer is actually both, but it does come ultimately more through the influence of the Southern Kingdom because
Yep.
the Northern Kingdom was destroyed by Assyria, right?
Right.
120 years before the Southern Kingdom is destroyed by Babylon.
Right.
But at least the Southern Kingdom returns after
Right.
70 years back to Jerusalem, right? Archaeology shows that the population of the Southern Kingdom increased explosively around 720 BC,
Right.
which is when the Northern Kingdom fell.
Right.
It's when all the refugees, all the Ephraimites and the Manasseites, and
Right.
all those people came fleeing to their neighbor because Assyria was worse than Judah.
Right.
And so now you have two groups of people in the same nation that have been separate for a few hundred years that have different versions of their scripture and their history.
Mm.
So the documentary hypothesis is that there's two different original sources. Scholars called they call it E and J,
Okay.
which might as well stand for Ephraim and Judah,
That's kind of what I was going with,
but
but
it's Elohist for Elohim
right.
and Yah
Right.
for Jehovah for Yahwist because the German guy that postulated this theory, J is for Jehovah.
And
It's German,
do you
right?
subscribe to that?
I'm big into this right now.
Okay.
Um, because it tends to give the restoration huge support because Joseph Smith told us we believe the Bible to be the word of God in as much as it is translated correctly, right? And
Oh,
what do we believe the Book of Mormon is? It's a big anthology of records kept by a Nephite nation.
right.
The Bible's essentially the same thing.
Yes.
The Old
Yep.
Testament, at least. The New Testament's a little bit different. But then the Bible is just the sandwich of the New Testament, which is its entirely different genre of testimonies,
Right.
and then the Old Testament, which itself is a library and collection and anthology of the prophets and the histories of
Interesting.
two different kingdoms.
Right.
And this also makes the brothers motif super interesting too, because you have it's Ephraim and Judah, but then you see all over again Cain and Abel,
Right.
Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. And you don't think of it
No.
in that breakdown, but now it starts to make sense. There's this brother motif all throughout.
Well, and now we start asking questions. We ask different questions, right? Because for a long time there was this theory that yeah, as long as it's translated correctly. So we're thinking post apostasy is when all those things were changed.
Oh no.
But if what you're saying here is correct, well now all of a sudden we have to ask the question how much where does the holy writ start and end, and where does the propaganda pick up?
And
Right?
and, so, and maybe it's not even that cut and dry, and it's just the way people view things, and it's not like one's gonna be always right and the other's gonna be always wrong.
Right.
It can't be just like it's like the crime scene thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
what's the perspective? And so we start to see a coalescing of a narrative, a unified narrative in 720-ish from two different kingdoms, but we see through text critical analysis that okay, some things seem to be sandwiched together,
Right.
and the flood story is one of those things.
Right.
But also, interesting if you didn't pick up on this, but I think you did. Calling these different origins or these different texts, these primary texts, Elohist and Yahwistic, based on the names of the different groups used for God,
Right.
Elohim and Jehovah. Isn't that super interesting?
Ooh. Yeah.
Because the church has trademarked Elohim, Jehovah being the Father,
Right.
our Heavenly Father, God, Senior, right? And then Jehovah is Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
Right.
But really, truly, linguistically, Elohim was the preferred name for the Ephraimites
Right.
before 720,
Yeah.
and Jehovah was the preferred name for God among Judah
Right.
before 720. And now you have to have the synergy of the two together.
Yeah.
And that's why you get the contraction, Lord God, in all capital letters. It's rendered in our English King James as the Lord God, but it's a contraction of Jehovah Elohim.
Interesting.
And why in certain chapters, like Genesis 1, is Elohist, presumably, because it's just Elohim all the way through.
Right.
And then chapter 2 of Genesis is also the creation again, but it's Jehovah, the
Right.
Lord. And so it's like these are the two different versions of the creation from the
Oh,
north and
yeah.
the south put back to back
Contract.
because it's
Okay.
the way to keep a national unity now,
Right.
to establish that universal religious unity
Right.
among the inhabitants of this of what is the only Israelitish kingdom left, which is Judah.
Right. Man, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And so
Phew.
you see these motifs pop up. It's called you start seeing things like doublets. It's all the and this is mind blowing stuff. Here's another one that's not Noah. But you have this motif of the kings of the land trying to steal Abraham's wife.
Right.
It happens once with Abraham and Sarah and Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
It happens another time with Abraham and Sarah and the king of the Philistines, Abimelech. And then it
Okay.
happens again with Isaac and Rebekah and the king of the Philistines, Abimelech.
Interesting.
That three times. Did it really happen three times, or is it the sandwiching of the oral traditions? And maybe the North was saying, this happened to Isaac. And the South is
Right.
saying, no, that happened to Abraham. And then other people are saying, well, did it happen with Abraham between the Philistines or the Egyptians?
Interesting.
Because it's weird that, like, it's like the saying of if every time I have that happened, if I had a nickel,
Right.
like, except for you wouldn't have many nickels, but it's weird that you wouldn't be rich, but it's weird that it happened more than twice or more than
Right.
once, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You
Whew.
start seeing these things, and anyway, so let's get into the flood version of this.
Okay.
Okay, the flood story is it seems there's other sources, by the way. There's later sources. There's the Deuteronomist, which seems to be a revision around 600 BC at the time of Lehi and Jeremiah
Right.
and Ishmael. And then there's a priestly revision, probably with Ezra and Nehemiah after the return from captivity. So this isn't, this seems to be J, or this seems to be the southern narrative and a later priestly narrative.
Right.
Anyway, so God says that humans are wicked twice for different reasons in chapter 6 of Genesis.
Right.
So that's weird.
Yeah.
Says that they're wicked and he's going to wipe them out
Says it twice.
twice with seven verses apart from each other for different reasons.
Interesting.
But when you don't know it, you're not going to pick it up. But it's super interesting. Next, God tells Noah, yeah. So he says God says that they're wicked. Then God tells Noah of his decision to wipe out all of life twice. So that's
Huh.
repeated, redundant almost, right?
Right.
God tells to gather each pair of animal species and put them on the ark twice.
Holy cow.
The story records that Noah fulfills all that God commanded him to do twice. The flood starts twice. The animals get on the ark twice. The flood waters lift the ark twice. And all the humans on the earth die or are wiped out twice in the span of two chapters. And at the very end, Noah sends out a raven to look for dry land, and then he
Right.
sends out a dove to look for dry land.
So your contention here, and forgive me if I'm trying to follow this.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I know
You
how it sounds.
your contention here that we're reading two different accounts that have been put back together?
They've been stitched like this. So who don't have the video won't be
Right.
able to see what I'm doing, but I'm just lacing my fingers together. And they're amalgamating it in a really slipshod way. And
Okay.
so people have done research on this, and you can actually, based on the language and the language changes
Right.
between this, and you can kind of see, oh, this verse is grammatically or stylistically different than this. And so you can kind of separate them and pull them apart, and they all read like one narrative
Interesting.
without the doublets now. So you can literally pull it apart and read it differently. People have done work on this. In fact, during on our chat for the class, I'll post a
Right.
PDF of it.
Okay.
'Cause I think it would be really boring for us to read these that
Sure. Sure.
for us
Yeah,
here.
absolutely.
But it ends with even down to the detail of the animal being different, with the raven and the dove being different.
Right. Oh.
And
So it's yeah, it's this stitching together.
and the Bible's a lot. It has a lot of stuff like that.
So let me ask you this. What can we point to? Because we know the separation, right? We know how that happens. But what's the coming back together? I mean, what's the impetus for the stitching it back together?
Trying to keep peace between and like so that you get all these Ephraimites and Judahites living together, and you're not going to say, well, we're going to go with Judah on that one and alienate all the Ephraimites, and so it's just political unity, perhaps.
Okay.
But it's really like, okay, is this really a problem? No, because this isn't any salvific issue.
No, it's not a problem. I just find it fascinating, right?
It is. It is super fascinating. But also, Joseph in Egypt has some of this too, where in one verse it says, I don't have all I might have some of these details wrong, but in one verse it says that the Midianites came and took Joseph when he was in the pit, and then others, I think it was the Egyptians, right? Or the Ishmaelites and the Midianites.
Right.
Yeah, Ishmaelites and the Midianites. And some it says Reuben, it was Reuben's idea to sell them, and then in others it was Judah's.
Right. Okay.
And so why would that be the case? Why would that be
Well,
the case? Because Judah
right.
is Judah. The North Kingdom would say Judah sold our
Right.
boy Joseph
Right.
into slavery, and the Jews would say, no, Reuben in the Northern Kingdom sold Joseph into
Right.
slavery. Ah, and so they're misremembering or remembering details depending on who they're throwing shade at politically.
And then you have to ask the question, maybe it's somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere,
Right.
maybe the truth's somewhere in the middle. Yes, absolutely.
And this is interesting and okay, now I might be treading into some dangerous waters
We're
here,
there. That's true.
but you know where I'm going.
I don't. I just think that this is stuff that most people probably are jarring with.
Now these two same accounts that you were just talking about, right?
With Joseph.
With Joseph. I think this has very interesting parallels to fundamentalism. Okay. Especially when you start talking about the Council North and the Council South.
Oh, bro.
Right? I'm just saying it's
No, that's so true.
It's eerily similar,
I've
right?
heard, and I've heard both sides too. And I've always just said I don't have skin in the game because I was
Me neither.
you and I weren't born into the families on either side.
Right.
We're the ones that were split
I
down
don't
together.
have skin in this game, so I'm always interested and desirous to hear what the two camps say, right? But at some point, we're kind of like 100 years removed now,
We are.
and it's like, does it change the motif? I don't think it does,
It doesn't.
right?
Yeah, it's so interesting because
but it's the same thing, right? I mean,
a counter argument can be made that like, okay, did Isaac beguiled Jacob? No, or Jacob beguiled Isaac to get the blessing,
right?
and so, but it was valid in the eyes of the scriptures, and that could be the defense against the Southern Council for ruling all Reds calling.
Yep.
But then I'm also like, sometimes one manism seems to be a problem, and I'm more for the council type thing. So
Right.
I also get why the council was like, maybe we don't want to sustain rule in all red too. I get
Right.
both sides.
I do too. I get both sides as well, right? And I just find that the parallel is
No,
interesting.
that's a very good observation, I think.
I mean, right down to north and south, right?
It is. It is. Um, so yeah, also throughout the this narrative of the flood, you have Elohim and Jehovah popping up as different names
Right.
throughout
Yep.
cohesively as you separate, right? Also another the terminology is sometimes like in one version, in one part of the original, it says God destroys the earth. And in the other verses it says God wipes off the face of the earth. So
Okay.
destroys the earth, wipes off the face of the earth. Different language.
Interesting.
Or the surface of the earth or ground. Yeah, the surface of the ground dries and the earth dries is the other doublet.
Right.
And it says it in different places. And so
Right.
it's different language, consistent, and like as if it was two different narratives put together. And you get all this repetition. Also, there's apparent contradictions that this brings in when you
Right.
really analyze it. Like, is Noah supposed to bring one pair of each kind of animal, or is he supposed to bring seven pairs of clean animals plus birds and only one pair of unclean animals? Because one of the versions says bring two of every kind, and then the other narrative spliced in says bring seven of every kind of clean and two of every unclean.
Okay. All right. You know what else I was thinking about the Noah story and as far as the animals?
Uh-huh.
And follow me out. I'm willing to be wrong on this. So if you got something to push back with it,
Sure.
I'm more interested to hear. I think Noah only takes animals that haven't been domesticated at that time.
I don't recall.
The reason I say that is that, the animals just come and start loading up on the ark, right?
That's what it seems like.
So they're probably not in captivity,
Right. Gotcha.
which is interesting to think about, right? Were there other animals that were domesticated that were subject to that same curse of excessive violence? Just a thought.
The rabbinical, I think it's rabbinical, the Jewish tradition is that the animals obeyed Noah as Lord of the earth wearing Adam's garments.
Okay, well that changes things. Yeah,
But that's
yeah, that changes
that's
things.
the
Yeah,
mystic view, which is
yeah,
fine.
yeah,
Totally fine. Very plausible to me.
yeah.
It's also why Hugh Nibley says that Nimrod, thus inheriting that through Ham stealing it and whatever, abused it to claim that he was this great hunter when
Oh,
he's
and
really just hacking the system by wearing the
yeah,
garments.
he's basically doing the thing where you're throwing out the salt lick almost
Yeah, yeah,
to the deer to have him walk up and then
yeah.
okay, I
And
got
shoot
you.
him, right?
Yeah, yeah. Interesting.
So the flood lasts 40 days and nights, but then it'll also last for 150 days.
Right.
And right? So
Mm,
contradictions. Does God have a pact with Noah from the beginning,
right.
or is God making a pact with Noah after Noah gets off the ark and then builds an altar, offers a sacrifice? God smells the sweet smelling savor and says, "Oh, I'm pleased, Noah. Guess
Yeah,
what? I'm not going to destroy the earth and I'll make a covenant with you now."
right.
So which is it?
Mm,
Now we would say both Latter-day Saint wise, but
right.
from a form critical analysis, it
Right.
seems like there's consistently different themes and stories happening here.
Absolutely it does. Oh, that's interesting.
Um, People will say that the priestly text, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with priestly and Yahwist, not Elohist and Yahwist. The ways to identify there's certain ways to identify priestly texts throughout
Right.
the scriptures because they're elsewhere as well. A priestly text is longer and filled with technical details. They love details.
Right.
Anytime the scriptures are going through details like crazy, it's probably the priests, meaning the authors of
Right.
that of splicing in a version of something, or amending it. Right. So all the details, how to build the ark, finish it to a cubit, 300 cubits by whatever, by whatever, by whatever. You shall pitch it within and without with pitch. All those things. The priests love the details. Furthermore, God plans the covenant in advance, and no sacrifice is mentioned in the priestly once you take them apart. P's description, or the priest's description of the flood, is also closely connected with a part of the P creation story concerning the creation and the separation of the waters from the earth in Genesis.
Right.
The Yahwist text is shorter and has fewer specifics. Nevertheless, its account of the bird looking for land is longer, and it includes the sacrifice and the story of Noah getting drunk. Like P, J's flood connects it to the creation story, which begins with the need for rain. However, instead of undoing creation, as in the P source, J reflects an overabundance of the creative force, rain, which destroys life. The sacrifice fits with J's worldview that the ancients did sacrifices. That's going to be important in a second. While in the priestly source, sacrifice began only after the construction and sanctification of the divinely sanctioned tabernacle. Are you picking up what they're
Yep.
putting down there? So the
Yep.
priestly narrative with the flood omitted Noah offering sacrifice because
that was only
Levites can do it.
Yep. Yep.
Which goes back to our
Oh.
Jewish sectaries in the time of Christ saying our Enoch priesthood stuff predates the Levites.
Right.
And so
Right.
there's been tension
Yeah.
here for a long time.
Ooh. And it's so interesting to get that look at it, right? Because if you can tell that if what you're saying there has validity, which I believe it does, it's that even Holy Writ isn't necessarily immune to, well, and I think we have to understand here too. I think this is a good place to bring this up. We look at it now as Holy Writ.
Right. Well, but yeah, okay, so let's use like Protestant Christians as the example. They think God came and dictated that thing word for word, the
Right.
Bible being
Right.
that thing. When they were the ones that took out the Apocrypha
Yeah.
out of the Deuterocanon outside at the end of the Catholic Bible,
Yep.
and yoinked that thing and then says to us Mormons, you can't take away from this book without bringing curses.
Right. Right. Right.
You know?
Well, and I think it's important to realize too that we look at it as Holy Writ now.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure at the time it was being written down that it was just a record.
Yeah, some of it was just that.
You know, and so we have to realize that yes, it is inspired. It is the word of God, but it's also filtered through men.
So I've not done a deep dive on Chronicles yet, but I've learned in accordance with this theory or this hypothesis, I'll say, it seems as if Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings are all Judah
Okay.
history, the secular history of Judah, with Deuteronomy reforms from 600 BC, in addition to the original the compilation that it would have been in its pre-existent form and before 720, before it got compiled with northern stuff. But Chronicles is the northern side of the debate.
Okay. Interesting.
And it's no one really goes through that because like it starts with all the genealogy over again, and it's just like hard to get through. But when it really gets going, it's like Ephraim's point of view.
Okay.
On some things. And so there's conflict there again between Kings and Chronicles.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Whew. It just casts a whole new light on it, right?
The Bible's my favorite book. I also want to state that for this podcast. The Bible by far is my favorite book.
Well, and here's the thing, right? Some people will hear this and think, well, are you discrediting the Bible's divine
status?
Yeah, thank you. I was blanking on the word. That's not it at all.
Nope, I don't think so.
I don't think we are one bit calling into question the Bible's divinity. I think what we are saying is that these things still get filtered through men.
They do. And the Book of Mormon says that Moroni, whoever's writing that last page, right? If they be the mistakes, mistakes in this book, it's the mistakes of men and not God.
Yeah.
Because guess what? He had to do the same thing. Not that Moroni, I'm accusing Mormon or Moroni of having malintentions, but he had to work with other people's records.
Yep. And here's the other thing, right? We even see this blatantly in the New Testament. right?
Uh-huh.
When it talks about the apostles running to the tomb, and I can't remember which one just decides to put in there,
Oh,
and I
I
got there
outrun Peter.
first.
Yeah.
I'm like, what the hell's going on here, right? Like you can tell there's even maybe some tension there,
Oh, and there's
right?
like little diss tracks between
Yeah,
these people all the time.
right. And I think that and let me say this, those things,
Hilarious.
well, it's hilarious, but also I think we need to understand that even those things I think are worthwhile to us because we get now this understanding that maybe sometimes through man's um folly a little bit, certain things are exposed that are useful for us, right? And so even the things that we would classify as human in origin are really divinely inspired.
Well, they are too, because let's just go back to Genesis. Like you and I aren't young Earth creationists,
Right.
but the creation, and funny enough, um, some Christian scholars, but more in the secular world, are starting to analyze Genesis and be like, this is a temple text.
No kidding.
And so, what's more of value? The fact that it's Genesis is symbolic and teaching eternal truths, and it wasn't a literal science handbook or a history textbook.
Right.
What's more important? I know what's more important to me.
I know the temple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so to have whoever the editor is or the writer give me a version of events that's going to teach me about eternal truths in the temple
Right.
versus
Yeah.
how God slammed molecules together in the cosmic super collider to make the I
Right.
don't care.
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
I do care, but
exactly.
it's a different
Yeah,
conversation.
it's a different conversation. And it's one that quite frankly doesn't carry the same kind of eternal consequence.
Right. No, and I love science too, but it's not the point of that book.
No. No, it's not.
Okay, so also the images of God are different between P and J. Uh, and the voice is also different.
Okay.
So in J, it's the narrative kind of sounds like it's first person sometimes from God, like he's thinking his own thoughts,
Right.
and the narrator's writing as if God is thinking aloud,
Right.
kind of thing. Uh, whereas the priestly source does not use anthropomorphic language about God.
Really.
Well, they don't believe that God's anthropomorphic at that point.
Mm,
That at the point that that source comes in, they've abandoned
right.
they've abandoned the idea of a corporeal, literal
God.
God. But Jay's old enough that it would have retained some of that.
Okay.
Uh, in Jay, God can change his mind on certain things.
We've seen that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yep.
And with P, God has planned everything in advance, and it's omniscient.
It's interesting. They're even fighting over who God is,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Which again is very Mormon in some ways, right? I mean, if you look at our differences with the LDS Church, we argue, we don't
Yeah,
argue about is God corporeal, but we do argue about who he is.
that's true. That's very true. So D and P are later sources than J and E, and it seems that they are very concerned between 600 and 500 BC or so that there's strict regulation regarding the temple and priesthood privileges, such as this a central locus in Jerusalem, where there used to be, it seems even archaeologically that there used to be temples outside of Jerusalem, but then around 600 BC, and then after the return from the captivity, you could not offer sacrifices or build rudimentary temple shrines outside of the land of Jerusalem, right?
When was that?
But it starts being enforced around 600 BC, the time that Lehi and Jeremiah are around.
That's interesting because I know that there has been some recent discoveries where they have found like mini temples.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying is that archaeology shows that this wasn't the case, that, oh, God said you can't have any temple besides in Jerusalem. But the Deuteronomists made the Bible say that. Because it says, and that's the biggest problem with Jews and with Christians against Mormons and our temple stuff is they say the scriptures say there's only one place a temple can be, and that's Jerusalem.
Except for it didn't until the Deuteronomists got a hold of it.
That's what's up. And you got
Yeah.
Lehi in his land operating a mini temple slash altar situation, maybe, because he's got his temple
Right.
event and he's got this vision and he sees God with a concourse of angels around him, which is a circle, by the way.
Yep.
And so that's typical of temple stuff,
Yep.
you know. And then they come and bring him a book, which is more temple stuff. And so, but that's outlawed by Deuteronomy
Hmm.
and by the priests. And the priests go to the extent of saying none of the patriarchs even did sacrifice, but they can't just get rid of it wholesale because they had enough remnant of Ephraim or Judah from before that knew that
So,
the patriarchs offered sacrifice, but they hated it because it led to this people
question of
saying
authority.
there's priesthood before Levi.
Right. And look, you can't get rid of it totally, right? Because I mean, Abraham is offering sacrifices all the time.
Yeah. And there's things like the Deuteronomists say that all the good kings are the ones that went and destroyed these worship sites with groves with sacred trees, or altars that were on the tops of mountains.
Right.
And it makes it sound like they were all pagan gods. That might be true. But it also might just be a narrative politically to what's the word? Correlate. That word. Correlate everything.
Yeah.
Violently correlate everything.
Right.
And
So you're thinking that maybe they went out and actually destroyed some of these other temples that were to the Lord
yeah,
and actually got rid of them just to
yeah,
enforce this.
so vowel pointing became a thing after Christ, which like narrowly makes it so that you have to read the Old Testament a certain way. But and so some people start reading things without the vowel pointing to see how flexible the Hebrew can be. And Mike Day and Dave Butler on the Stick of Joseph podcast or Ward Radio have talked about this. And I was like, on some of this before. But as I've gotten more into this, I've really thinking that there's some line of truth with this. But they say that King Josiah killed the Sodomites that were in the temple. And then people will say, oh, that's so good of him because how dare there be
Right.
Sodomites in the temple? But like the vowel pointing makes it you forced to read it sodomite, but like if you don't do that, I guess there's another word. It's kamerim
Okay.
in Hebrew, which is like a plural of something that sounds a hell of a lot like Camorra.
Oh,
Camorra in plural, which is uh also used as a so like the Book of Mormon's not written in Hebrew, right?
no.
But we know based on phonetics, kind of sort of, we can make good guesses sometimes what the roots could have been in Hebrew for a word.
Right.
This sounds like Camorra. A word in Hebrew that sounds like Camorra is like a word used for priests sometimes.
Oh,
And so Camorra, the hill Camorra, could have been the hill of priests.
gotcha. Okay, so back to this idea that vowel pointing, that that sodomites have kind of a different meaning.
Yeah,
Is that what I'm picking
yeah,
up?
so it's a gloss over this old term that you could be read as kamerim, which is another word used for priests in other contexts,
Right.
as if Josiah or the Jews later after the time of Christ were defending Josiah's reforms by saying, "Oh, there's killing these male prostitutes that just happened to be in the temple," where
Oh.
really they were maybe they were priests that weren't Levites, and there was a power struggle,
Ooh.
and that's happening around the time that Lehi and Jeremiah would have been young men.
Okay.
And you have these big upheaval because it makes no sense. And this is another proof for Mormonism, and why it's good for the restoration to have this idea of the source criticism because why does preaching about the Messiah in the days of Lehi get him in trouble unless they got rid of all
Right.
that stuff?
Yeah.
Because there's all this upheaval in his youth and this correlation, and he remembers the old ways. He is out and about saying, "Remember, remember." And Jeremiah is out there saying, "Remember, remember," because the theology has changed. There's no more Christ.
Right.
They've de-anthropomorphized God,
Right.
all of this stuff. And in fact, in Leviticus, for example, when it gives all the holy days, one of them is the Day of Atonement,
Yeah.
which necessitates a messianic figure, the Messiah, as we understand it, right? The Deuteronomy also recapitulates the holy days, but
Right.
one's missing, the Day of Atonement,
Oh,
meaning they were all about the atonement.
right.
They just follow the law. The law
Yeah.
saves you.
I can't remember who I was talking to, but he was telling me he had some background in Judaism. And he said the thing about the Sadducees and the Pharisees that I think kind of goes along with that is that the Sadducees were all about the temple. The Pharisees were all about the written law.
Yeah, but at the same time, the Sadducees also wanted to de-emphasize all the angels, God having a body.
Right.
So it was about the temple observances, but none of the life within the temple.
Right. Right.
None of the eternal significance.
Right. And the Pharisees seem to be more geared towards what was written down,
And they had the mystic stuff,
and they had the mystic
but
stuff.
they hated the temple because they had no claim to the priesthood.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And it's very interesting to see how these parallels play out over and over. And ultimately, you can say who wins in Judaism?
Pharisees.
It's the Pharisees,
Yeah.
right? Because the temple's
Yeah.
eventually destroyed, right? I mean,
Rabbinical Judaism is by and large the biggest part of modern, like the remnant of Judaism today, and that rabbinical is Pharisee,
right.
that tradition.
Yep. Absolutely. Interesting.
And so some things may not be as they appear in the scriptures, like the fact that Melchizedek priests may have existed. I think this is the gospel history according to Michael Ness. I think that there was perhaps a mini dispensation of Melchizedek priesthood from Samuel down to Lehi, and then Lehi inherits it after underground style after Josiah and others kill the Melchizedek priests off, and then he takes it to America,
to the new world.
to the new world with the Nephites, and they have the Melchizedek priesthood, but then the Jews are left with nothing. Essentially, they have the Levites, but
Right.
um, and I think that because and so Joseph Smith and John Taylor say stuff like God ordained the prophets himself, and that's true because we talked about that. But you got to qualify on a certain level before that, perhaps, right?
Right.
I don't want to unequivocally say, but to me, when I see the story of Samuel, this is a big eye opener to me for this paradigm because it says that there was no open vision in the for hundreds of years between Samuel and Joshua, and there was no prophet or open vision like no one could communicate with the Lord like Moses or Joshua until Samuel, and that he's called as a young man. He's an Ephraimite, not a Levite, but he's adopted by Eli
Right.
to serve in the temple, but he's an Ephraimite.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden, prophets show up all over the place. And they're all over the place until they start getting killed off by Jezebel and the Baal
Right.
priests. But then there's a resurgence by the time Elisha takes over. There's like six more schools of the prophets, and they're in different cities: Jericho, Gilgal, Jerusalem, Shiloh, and like two others. And there's more prophets, and that's around 720 BC or before. That's all before 720 BC, before the northern kingdom is destroyed, and then that happens, and then the refugees flee to Jerusalem.
Interesting.
And so I think that all the way down past Isaiah, there was Melchizedek priesthood.
This plays into, in a weird way, into this whole idea of why don't we see Hebrew blood in America among the Native Americans? And Ken Peterson, shout out to him, pointed this out to me in one episode we did. Lehi wasn't a Jew.
No, he was Manasseh. And
He's
he held
Manasseh,
from the
right?
northern kingdom, and he held the high priesthood.
Right. And so when people say, well, we're not seeing any Hebrew DNA in the Native Americans, dude, I must have been dumb, right? Because until that's explained to me, I'm like, oh, well, crap, then you shouldn't expect to see any, right? It's something different.
Not if you're testing modern Jews for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I find that to be very fascinating as well. The other thing I want to say, to back up your point that Lehi's dealing with the Melchizedek priesthood, if he was an adherent to just Judaism,
Uh-huh.
right? He's got no business making a temple once they get to the New World.
Yep.
None.
But what do they do?
They make a
Nephi
temple
makes a temple. Yeah.
in the manner of Solomon's temple, save it was built out of wood
Right.
and not stone.
Right.
And so somehow they're feeling empowered.
Because they don't believe in Deuteronomy.
Right.
Because Lehi was fighting against it in his day. Yeah. And so Isaiah is messianic all the way through and through and through. And that's why Nephi and Lehi and those prophets and the Nephites love Isaiah because he was the last big prophet among the Jews before the Deuteronomistic reforms. That was like the Messiah is part of our religion. And then they wiped all that out.
Okay. So we're going to go on another tangent here because I need to clear this up. So who are the Deuteronomists exactly?
Scribes,
They're scribes.
scholars,
Okay.
and lawyers.
So do they have a connection with the book of Deuteronomy?
Yes.
How so?
They basically created the basic skeleton or form that it's in now.
Okay.
Not that there wasn't an original book. So Deuteronomy literally means second law,
Okay.
which is interesting. But it's because it's a recap of all the other laws that Moses already gave.
Okay.
But now they're putting their own spin on it. And so in Deuteronomy, it says, and it seems like, so there was probably an original version, and it might not have been called Deuteronomy, but I'm not going to say unequivocally on that. Where it says God spake to Moses face to face. And on the same page later, it says, but no, he really didn't see God face to face.
Okay.
So they started putting their views in. Just like we see with J and P with a flood narrative, stitching it together, they stitched their views in something that was already there to completely recalibrate the reading.
Okay.
To view God the way that they viewed it, to view the temple the way that they viewed it, to de-emphasize things they wanted de-emphasized, to emphasize the law versus atonement.
Okay.
Those kinds of things.
So let me ask you this. How do you view the book of Deuteronomy then?
I like it actually.
Okay.
But, it's been 7 years since I've read it all the way through.
Right.
But I remember liking it when I read it on my mission.
So do you feel that the book of Deuteronomy is inspired, or do you feel like it's just revised stuff?
I think if you have an understanding holistically of the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's not problematic to anyone to read those scriptures and get the good stuff out of it that, and maybe the Deuteronomists had some truth.
Right.
And weren't wrong on everything. But there's a problem where it came to the political stuff for sure.
Mm-hmm.
If they truly were responsible for an apostasy type situation, which I can prove was happening, by the way.
Can you?
Yeah, from Jeremiah.
Okay.
He was a contemporary of all this, right?
Okay. Because I do like Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy seems to be like a lot of the books of Moses, and certainly the New Testament falls into this, and later those other prophets, Isaiah and that sort of thing. They're talking by and large about individuals, right? You're going to need to do this, and you need to have your heart right. Deuteronomy is an interesting book because it seems to be talking about national law a lot of times, right? Which I do find fascinating, and I think there's something there to that.
So Mike Day said something really interesting on this is if you look at ancient documents from Assyria, it's called suzerain vassal treaties.
Okay.
And it's the political arrangement that Assyria would make and Babylon would also make with smaller countries to come under our umbrella. We'll protect you against your enemies and our enemies if you tribute and if you're loyal and all of this.
Okay.
And it looks like, according to Mike Day, that what the Deuteronomists did is they took the Assyrian treaty and instead of having the king of Assyria, they had God. They placed God in the place. And so politically, they were Judah wasn't under Assyria, but Israel was, I think, until they rebelled. But Judah they had deals with Babylon at a certain level, which they reneged on. It got them into trouble. But you couldn't just. It seems like it was an expedient thing to okay, we're civilly under the thumb of a bigger empire. We don't want to, and we have to enforce that law. But let's say we're honoring God,
Okay.
but the outlines are all very much like this is an Assyrian political document in Deuteronomy,
Interesting. Hmm. That's fascinating.
isn't it?
That is very fascinating. All right, so you had some.
So there's a million different ways. The King James version of the scripture is not the best, but you look at all the other versions of the Bible because there's a lot, and God didn't just come
Yeah.
down and dictate it. But the law is Torah in Hebrew, right? So some versions say it's the Torah in this, but here's a let's find a good version. Dude, I don't even know what some of these stand for. Here's one. How can you say, this is Jeremiah saying, this is Jeremiah 8, verse 8, chapter 8, verse 8. How can you say that we are wise and we possess the Lord's instruction, or the Torah, it's
Hmm.
rendered in some ways? How can you say we possess the Torah when the lying pens of the scribes have surely distorted it?
Ooh.
So the scholars say Deuteronomist changed things at 600 BC. Lehi is saying, I'm preaching the atonement and Christ, and they hated me for it. And Jeremiah, a contemporary of Lehi, is saying, all you scribes say you're so wise because we have the law of Moses, the Torah, the first five books,
Right.
but you've changed it. Your
Interesting.
lying scribes have already changed it. So all that fits really well together.
Yeah, it does. Holy cow. Oh.
Yeah, there's and all the other versions besides the King James version say it really well. The King James is a little cumbersome with the way it's worded, but in any case, it seems something is happening for sure in religious reforms at 600 BC that got Jeremiah and Lehi ostracized. Because Jeremiah says there's all these other prophets running around,
Right.
and they were saying politically, yeah, we're good to fight Babylon. And Jeremiah was like the defeatist saying, no, surrender, and that's the only way to get out of this. And they wouldn't.
Wait, there were more than one prophet running around at a time?
Yeah, prophet, right? Because yeah, obviously were they listening to the Lord? It seems like some, like Jeremiah and Lehi were, but these other prophets were wrong.
Huh.
Yeah,
So yeah, well, I wasn't
not
taking
inspired.
I was taking it a different direction. I was like, you mean there could be more than one man
I know
on
where
the
you went
earth?
there, but it fits
Yeah.
with both.
Yeah, it fits with both. Yeah. Interesting. Huh.
And so there's some other interesting things too, like the Deuteronomists outlaw things that the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do a lot.
Really, such as?
Well, they say to go destroy the groves
Mm-hmm.
and stuff, but Abraham goes to a grove with a sacred tree, and it's called the Oak of Mamre or Mamre or whatever, and I can't remember what it all is tied into that story, but I think that's actually where he makes the covenant with God, and it changes his name. I think it's that place
Okay.
from Abram to Abraham. And the tree is symbolic of the tree of life, and especially the feminine component, Heavenly Mother kind of stuff.
Right.
And that was also one of the reforms is de-emphasize the fact that God was anthropomorphic and had a wife,
Right.
you know. And so, but Abraham's making sacrifice and worshiping in a primitive temple setting in a grove with a sacred tree. Uh, Jacob goes to Bethel, the house of God, and sets up a stone altar outside of Jerusalem and has this visionary experience where he sees angels ascending and descending. It's
Right.
called Jacob's ladder.
Yep.
That's against what Deuteronomy says to do. You can't set up an altar and outside
Ooh.
of all that. So the patriarchs were doing things like that Deuteronomy says you don't do. But the J and the E source maintain that the patriarchs were doing priesthood stuff.
Outside of a temple
Yeah,
and outside of
correlate. Yeah,
authorized lines.
yeah, outside of correlation.
Now let me ask you this, and maybe this is a connection too far or something maybe you're not read on, but we do have certain Hebraic expressions of like Jehovah and his Asherah.
Yeah, yeah,
Is this
yeah.
the same time period where that seems to be flipped around and Asherah becomes more of a they ascribe her to be more of a pagan deity than
Well,
anything else?
yeah, and part of the reason is because the priests of Baal came in and they married symbolically Baal to Asherah, right?
Okay.
And so they're able to point to, oh, look, this is Baalism, perhaps, and that was a convenient way for them to disregard
Right.
the duality of God being both male and feminine, the
Right.
sacred nature of which is representative in humanity, just being we're gods in embryo, right? We're
Right.
male and female, we're Adam and Eve,
Right.
you know.
I found that very fascinating because if I'm not mistaken, and if anyone's out there and wants to fact check me, that's fine. But I believe it was a seal, if I'm not mistaken, but it was like a clay or pottery seal that talked about God, Jehovah and his Asherah.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's in Egypt, I believe. And so yeah,
And if I'm not mistaken, there was a tree on there
yeah,
too.
no, Ashra is always a sacred tree, always a sacred tree. And so you see Nephi having his vision of the tree of life, and the tree is precious above all. And what is the fruit of the tree? It's Jesus Christ, is the son of the mother.
Right.
Just as much as he's the son of the father, but it's the we see this imagery all the time of the child born of the woman.
Right.
In fact, blew my mind when I realized that. So in ancient Egypt and stuff, you see Osiris or Horus sitting on thrones, but sometimes he's sitting on the lap of Isis, his mom,
Right.
and he's a child and he's being breastfed or whatever sometimes. But you see the Christian version of that with like baby Jesus and Mary.
Right.
It's the same imagery, and so the secular modern people would be like, "Oh, Christianity is just this continuation of this motif from Egypt mythology, and it's nothing special." And they'll use that to debunk
Christianity.
Christianity,
Yeah.
whatever. I don't care about that. But those motifs are there. But then you have the New Testament stuff where it says that Christ. So let me put it in that. So you have these Egyptian gods and other variations. It's all over the ancient world that the Son of God is enthroned on his mother's lap.
Right.
That's his throne. The mom is the throne, symbolically. In
Okay.
fact, Isis is wearing a throne on her head. Like
Yep.
you've seen
Yep.
the Egyptian gods and they have the animal heads or whatever.
Yep.
Isis has a throne on her head.
Interesting.
So she's the throne. And so Christ being crucified or hanged on a tree, as it says in the New Testament, is Christ enthroned.
Interesting. Whew.
Christ is being enthroned in sacred imagery when he was crucified.
So it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the 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 Deuteronomists seem to want to funnel everything through one source, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that
and they
source,
just ascribe all these attributes and everything into this one God, omni God, and distort things and amalgamate everything at the same time and make him sexless and the source of all these attributes
interesting.
and confound the whole thing. And there's no need for, Christ can't be the son of God because Israel is the only son of God, as a nation.
Right.
It becomes ascribed to Jacob, and Israel is the son of God.
Okay.
So anytime you read the prophets where it says, like Isaiah, they interpreted that to be, oh, we are the son, collectively representative of this divine son figure because Jacob is God's chosen.
So let me ask you this question then, right? And this is just my question, just pushing back a little bit. If these Deuteronomists were doing this and they were wanting to, let's just take the patriarchs, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They want to get rid of any altar worship outside of Jerusalem, outside
Mm-hmm.
the temple. Why do they allow the Abraham story to remain as it is?
It's a good question.
Why do they allow, because that to me seems to would defeat your purpose a little bit, right?
Well, I don't know that
Unless
they
they're
could.
doing the same thing that Christians have done for a long time, which is
What they seem to have
at
done.
Moses things change.
Yeah, what it seems to have done, for example, with Moses is, oh, it says that he said so that he saw God face to face, but really he didn't because you can't see God. And so you have these little things afterwards that seems like they get put in to just explain it away a different way
Okay,
without fully removing or contradicting it.
gotcha.
And was it political expediency that they didn't want? It's like maybe it's like the church introducing small changes over a period of 5 years with four different temple changes to
Right,
boil the frog slowly.
right.
I,
Okay,
I don't know. Before it jumps out of the water and says hello.
gotcha.
Maybe.
Maybe they intended to and just didn't get around to it.
Yeah, or it was this, yeah, or the narrative just won. The oral tradition to
One
interpret
out.
it won, you know. But there's all, there's weird stuff like this in Deuteronomy. During the conquest, during while Moses is leading the children of Israel back towards the promised land, he says to them, "Ye shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods. So destroy the places upon the high mountains, upon the hills, and under every green tree." Now, this can be read to be what you would call an anachronistic revision,
Right,
because it's destroying all the things that the patriarchs were cool with,
right.
apparently, as long as it was to the true God, their God, and not like idols, but like they're just wrapping it into idols, right? "And ye shall overthrow their altars, and break their pillars, and burn their groves with fire, and ye shall hew down the graven images of their gods, and destroy their names out of that place." And then it says, "Ye shall not do so unto the Lord your God." Meaning, it seems maybe that there was already altars in the land of the promised land unto the Lord.
Ooh.
So you're go in there and destroy all the altars and places, not to our God, but do not so unto the Lord your God.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's the best way I can read that
Right,
there. And it's just right there that there's thing it shows that it wasn't always that way.
right.
And it's a little evidence that never got fully taken out. Yeah.
Ooh. Well, that was an interesting tangent about the
Yeah.
Deuteronomist. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Whew. That changes that changes some things.
It does. It does. The next part's my favorite part of this
Okay.
presentation. We're going to talk about the ark.
All right.
Okay. How do I want to go about this? So we talked about in the classes and probably on this podcast. Uh, in Scripture, the Garden of Eden, the temple, mountains, um, are all interchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
And Eden and the temple, it seems, were divided into three spaces.
Right.
Um, and the temple was for sure at the time of Solomon's temple was for sure divided into three spaces. The tabernacle was besides the courtyard, so it had, or did it have four? Not, or not really. No, it had three too, for all intents and purposes. Yeah, with the courtyard, it had three. But when I was doing the Enoch study stuff, they talked about, or some of the scholars, and I wish I had brought up the source for this, but I can't find it now, or I didn't go look for it. But they said that maybe during the second temple period, Herod's temple, or before it was Herod's temple, because Herod remodels the second temple, but during the second temple period, perhaps the temple was divided not into three, but seven spaces.
Interesting.
And so if heaven and mountains and Eden and the temple are all the same, you get in the apocryphal literature and even in our colloquial language, you have seven heavens.
Right.
Enoch traverses in the third Enoch, especially seven heavens before he gets to the throne of God, which is the holy place. And the book of the third Enoch, its proper name is the Sefer Hekalot, which is the book of palaces
Okay.
or the book of temples.
Oh, okay.
And so the Hekal was the second room for the temple, but it was also used as a colloquial term for the whole temple.
Okay.
And so, yeah, the Book of Temples is how you can read that. And he's going through the seven heavens. And so
Right.
we talked about how this preserves the memory of, because Third Enoch was written by a guy who was born in 70 AD. So it's after the temple's been destroyed.
Right.
And so it's a thing to preserve the memory of the temple, perhaps,
Okay.
because they had no access to it. Literally. So
Interesting.
it's preserving the mental furniture and framework of the temple because there's no physical temple left. So 7-part temple space is important mentally for initiates maybe to ponder, as is 3-part space, just the same. Dave Butler and Mike Day and those guys are really big on the 3-part space for their work that they're doing, which is totally true. I don't think that contradicts the 7-part space. I'm bringing up the 7-part space because that's fairly important with what we're about to talk about.
Okay.
But for example, pioneer era Mormon temples had 7-part space if they had a Holy of Holies.
Right.
You had the creation room,
Yep.
the garden room, the world room, a baptistry, which represents hell, descending below all things and rising in the resurrection again. The terrestrial room, the celestial room, and the Holy of Holies. That's 7.
Okay. Yep.
That's a 7-part space.
Yep.
Versus Solomon's 3-room and and Moses' tabernacle is 3 rooms. Right?
Interesting.
Do you know what the Enuma Elish is?
I have no idea, bro.
So that's the Babylonian uh corpus of mythology that has to do with the flood as
Okay.
well. Epic of Gilgamesh
Okay.
stuff.
All right. I'm tracking now.
So did you know that in the Epic of Gilgamesh there was an ark story?
I did. Yep. Yep. It didn't seem quite as grand as the Ark, right?
No, this is gonna blow your freaking mind, Dave.
Okay. All right.
So Gilgamesh's ark is 120 cubits cubed.
Okay.
But if you square it, with without it being 3-dimensional, but it was 3-dimensional, that's 140. So 120 squared is 14,400. So that's got the 144 imagery
Oh, okay.
going on there.
All right. Yeah.
Right? So
Yep.
that's sacred geometry, right?
Yep.
And it was divided into 7 levels.
Gilgamesh was.
The ark, so it was, how do you say this name? Because Noah's got the character that resembles Noah in this has a super convoluted name that I need to pronounce by reading it. It's Utnapishtim. So Utnapishtim is the Noah, and he builds the ark that preserves humanity because the gods decide that humans are too troublesome and pissing them off, and they decide to wipe out the earth with a flood. And one of the gods in the divine assembly, in the divine council of the gods, named Ea, goes and talks to Utnapishtim through a veil in a temple. It's a sanctuary made with reeds. That was in a peninsula or on a peninsula, and or whatever the inverted form of that is, a cape or a
Sure.
whatever. And I can't recall those details. And Ea goes down to the temple and is talking to Utnapishtim like a Catholic priest would talk to a member of the congregation through the screen.
Okay, a confession.
Right? It's just like that. And so these motifs
Interesting.
the veil is preserved.
Right.
This is imagery, right, from the temple, from our temple. Too,
Yeah.
right? Conversing with the Lord through the veil. Ea says the earth's going to be destroyed, and this is what you're going to do. And Ea tells him to take this building and deconstruct it and build the ark. So they take the temple and build it into the ark, which already has temple imagery at this point, right? And construct it into essentially it's what it is. It's a temple. And it's a perfect cube. Do you know what the Holy of Holies was in the Temple of Solomon?
Perfect cube.
It's a perfect cube. It's 10 cubits cubed.
Okay.
Versus 120, but whatever.
Right.
Whatever.
Same thing, yeah.
But the Kaaba in Mecca,
120 cubits.
I don't know about I should have looked that up, but it's a perfect cube.
Okay.
It's also attributed to have been built by Abraham and Ishmael.
Right.
Which leads me to think that was a temple sanctuary structure.
Yep. No, you're right.
All the way through. What is the New Jerusalem when it comes down in the Book of Revelations?
The cube.
It's a perfect cube with the tree of life being restored. So the
Ooh,
temple imagery through. So
that is crazy.
it gets better. Noah's Ark is 3 decks, 3-part temple space.
Okay.
Each deck is 3 times the size of exactly 3 times the size of the court of the tabernacle of Moses. So it's 3 divided by 3. So you
Okay.
have 9 equal segments. Each story is threes, divided by 3, and 3
Right.
stories. Uh, that makes 9 tabernacle courts in Noah's Ark. Each floor of the Gilgamesh Ark was also divided by 9.
Holy cow.
So that makes not in like because the ratios are different, but like this makes the Gilgamesh Ark roughly 7 times the magnitude numerically of Noah's. Not like in proportion to size, but
Right.
just like the way it was laid out and like symbolically, like 7, you
Right.
know, in times 7 in multitude. The Ark, in addition to the Temple of Solomon and the Tabernacle of Moses, are the only buildings in the Bible that are dictated by God through direct revelation as far as the architecture goes.
Right.
So the ark is fitting in with the temple as far, you know, through and through here. In the Septuagint, the word for ark, Noah's ark, and the Ark of the Covenant are the same word.
Mm.
And just, we kind of covered this a little bit, but my footnote here says the ark in the Babylonian myth more resembles the heavenly Holy of Holies / New Jerusalem in John's Revelation that returns to the earth than Noah's not cube-shaped ark, right? But
Mm.
there is consistent temple themes throughout all of this.
Ooh. There would have to be, right? And
There is. It's undeniable at this
yeah.
point, especially considering where we're going to go next.
Okay.
Do you have any questions or comments?
No, just it changes the perception of the arc now, right? I mean,
Yes.
I'm just imagining, right? Because this is, obviously well before the Levites.
Uh-huh.
Makes you wonder if ordinances weren't happening.
Well, then you have Levitical type ordinances happening at least because emphasis on clean animals, which are
Yep.
priestly sacrifice type stuff. So
Yep.
that's associated with the temple or
Yep.
with the ark and the temple. But getting into Genesis 9, I have this in my notes, this titled "The Temple Garden Restored Through Noah?" Question mark. So Genesis 9:1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Temple stuff.
Yep.
Temple covenants, right? Genesis 9, 8 through 9 and 11. And God spake unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there be any more flood to destroy the earth. So a promise to be fruitful.
Yep.
A covenant is established. Uh, in verse 12, God says, This is the token of the covenant I shall give to you. So now you got
Mm-hmm.
tokens and
Yep.
covenants and
Yep.
blessings.
Absolutely. Whoa. Yeah.
Um, Noah began to be a husbandman and planted a vineyard, which is analogous to the Garden of Eden.
Right.
So you have a new Garden of Eden. And he drank of the wine and was drunken and was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces went backwards, and they saw not their father's nakedness.
Mm.
They have garments in the equation with blessing to be fruitful, a covenant, and tokens.
Interesting.
And when that was happening, where was Noah? He was in a tent. What's a tent?
Tabernacle.
It's a tabernacle. It's a temple.
Yeah.
A rudimentary one,
Yep.
but it's through. And even so, the English translation says it was Noah's. It says his tent. Noah was in his tent. The Hebrew says that there's in the Hebrew there's a feminine possessive that would mean if you're translating it strictly, normally under normal conditions, it should be her tent. Okay.
Oh,
And so some rabbis and people have been like, oh, what is it? Well, if it, because they can't help but acknowledge that. And so they'll say stuff like, oh, that was Noah's wife's tent. And so the curse on Ham slash Canaan was because maybe he went in when Noah and his wife were intimate and therefore discovered his father's nakedness, as it says, and because Deuteronomy and Leviticus talk about laws regarding
right,
that, and there's also apocryphal stories in Judaism and even attributed to Joseph Smith that think that there was a more nefarious uh, interpretation of that. Um, Such that Ham went in to do either unspeakable crimes like a rape,
right.
essentially, or to castrate Noah.
Hmm.
Uh, I've heard that as well.
Wow.
The rabbis say that of both of those. Uh, I'm not inclined to think either way on those.
Right.
But so how do you explain her tent? Yeah, but that's what the conclusions that they come up with reading that. All the it's because the temple is female.
Oh, okay. I
Because
can see that. Yep.
the temple has a veil
Yep.
like a woman and a womb. And I'm not going to comment on what that means, but the temple has a womb.
Yeah.
And so the temple is female. So there is a temple setting happening in the tent. Um, in addition to the tent, Noah built an altar, offered sacrifice. We see that he made a covenant. This indicates temple and priesthood activity. Um, Jewish legends support or say that the temple in Jerusalem was built on what they called the foundation stone. Do you know what that is?
That sounds familiar.
So
Go
I think
ahead.
it's the same rock as the Dome of the Rock,
Right.
but it's uh, mythologically, whether this is literal or not, doesn't matter. Mythologically, the foundation stone is said to be the first place that the waters receded from. That was
Interesting.
uncovered when the waters receded from the flood, and so that's where the place where the temple was built. Anciently, temples were also consecrated on places with the same mythology
Right.
and um, built on top of other temples that when empires conquered other empires.
If I'm not mistaken, there was also a tradition, I can't remember if it's Hebrew or Islamic, that said that the Dome of the Rock was built over the place where uh, Abraham was going to offer up
Yeah,
Isaac.
the same place. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, the temple was built over that same place too. So it's both the same place. It's the place where the flood receded first. It's the place where Abraham went to offer Isaac. I think there's some other stories there. It's also the place where the flood started too.
Right.
And so this represents God conquering the chaos, which because the waters primordially represent chaos, because that's what the earth was before God made the
Right.
world, right? In Genesis 1, God's spirit was upon the face of the deep,
Right.
right?
Interesting. So I want to touch on Noah here for a second.
Yeah.
This will be a good place where I stop myself early and
Oh,
sure I
sure.
get to it. So there's an interesting quote from Joseph Smith
Yeah.
about Noah being drunk. Do you remember where he said there was?
Got it right here.
All right, go ahead and
Well,
read that.
or one of them, anyways. There might be two, but it says that Noah was not drunk, but in a vision. Is that
Is
the one
that
that you're
from
thinking of?
Joseph Smith?
Yeah.
There was another one that said that he was drunk, but that there was no sin in it.
Yes, that's also true.
Okay. I've wondered about that a lot, right? Like, because even though fundamentalists are, read the word of wisdom as it's given, right? It's
Yeah.
not a commandment.
Uh-huh. And some decide to live it strictly, and
Right.
some don't.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where no matter what the case is, there seems to be a little bit of a prohibition against being drunk, right? Or outside yourself a little bit. And I thought, how could Joseph say there was no sin in that? What's Joseph saying there? And I sat there and I thought about it and I thought about it. And this actually came from a guy who worked with me who had done a couple tours in Iraq. wasn't Mormon,
Okay.
but talking about Noah being drunk or whatever. He's like, I know why Noah got drunk. And I was like, well, explain it to me. And he said he had PTSD.
Hmm.
And I'm like, shut up. And he's like, think about it.
Yeah, from watching all of everyone die.
Can you imagine people beating on the ark? Let me in, let me in. And if you're a good man,
You'd want to, sure.
you'd want to.
Yeah.
But the Lord said, no. And you have to endure that. And you just have to sit and listen to the screams until the waters overtake you. And it's made me wonder. This is the book of Dave,
Sure.
page 1, verse 1. But maybe that's why there was no sin in it. Maybe that was the only way he could cope at that time.
So I want to take a different approach, but
Okay.
I've heard that before, and I'm not like dissing on that, but I do have another approach to this.
Okay.
Um, but before we get to that, real quick, Psalms 29 verse 10 talks about the Lord Jehovah being enthroned over the flood,
Mm-hmm.
which is just back to this temple, yeah, like the temple being the throne of God as well. That like okay, it's built on the place that memorializes God conquering chaos. Um, and the tent of Noah, that is this rudimentary ordinance house, ordinance building, whatever, the sacred sanctuary, being at the foot of the mountain, Mount Ararat, is also symbolic of the tabernacle of the congregation in Israel being at the foot of the mountain with Mount Sinai,
Oh, yeah.
with God at the top and the ark.
Yep.
You know,
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes a
so
lot of
there's
sense.
there's so much repeat imagery and
Yeah,
symbolism here.
there is.
And like I said, this is one of my favorite lessons because of all this stuff, because it just started blowing my mind when I was looking into this stuff. So the wine, back to the wine. I think there was something happening like what we would call perhaps a solemn assembly.
Okay. All right.
It's a temple setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Joseph Smith says that Noah was at what, apocryphally, this is a secondhand source. I don't have the source handy, but I think it's in words of Joseph Smith, though, actually. So maybe it's not secondhand. Noah was not drunk, but in a vision. And I would add, perhaps left helpless in a room in the tent slash temple, like Moses and Joseph Smith themselves were left helpless after their visionary
Right.
experiences, seeing God,
Yeah.
right? Because that's what it says, in Book of Moses.
Right.
They were completely fatigued after being in the glory of
Wiped out.
God,
Yep.
which allows Ham to come in and steal the garment
Right. Interesting.
versus him just being drunk. But there's should we just skip to that? Why why is why does it say he was drunk then? I don't know. Maybe we're dealing with interpolations. But so it seems as if the scriptures are trying to teach us that the flood and Noah is a second Adam, and that the flood is a literal recreation of the early, few chapters earlier in Genesis with the creation of Adam. For example, there's literary connections here between primordial waters before God,
Right.
creates or organizes the earth, and the flood waters. You have the Spirit of God upon the waters, and you have Noah and the ark upon the waters. You have a garden in Eden,
Right.
and you have a vineyard planted by Noah, garden tended by Adam, and vineyard tended by Noah and his sons. You have a garment of skins given to Adam and Eve, and then you have a garment of covering placed upon Noah.
Right.
You have fruit that precipitated a fall, and I think that the wine was to support the imagery of Noah having a fall, just like
Interesting. Okay.
just like Adam.
Okay. I
So
could.
so
Yeah.
so it's a literary device
Okay.
to emphasize what we're talking about earlier, maybe not literal historical truths, but symbolic truths,
Okay. I
because
got
we're
you.
going back into a fallen world
Right.
right away.
Yep.
There's the fall of Adam is equated to Noah's drunkenness, and then there's the curse of the serpent and the curse of Canaan.
Hmm. Yeah. It's all there.
It's all there symbolically. They all have their counterparts.
It's all a kind of temple motif.
100%. From the construction of the ark being revealed by the word of God, just like the tabernacle and Moses, to the compartmentalization of it, all the way down to all of that. It's temple through and through.
Interesting.
Um, there's also some, I think this was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm not sure, but there's something called the Genesis Apocryphon that kind of supports this quote from Joseph that Noah wasn't drunk but in a vision. Uh, this Jeffrey Bradshaw, who's a scholar in the church, a lot of this information I got from him. Some of it's my analysis, but he says that the prophet's view agrees with the Genesis Apocryphon, which immediately after describing a ritual where Noah and his family drank wine, reports in detail a divine dream vision that revealed the fate of Noah's posterity. This agrees with the general content of Enoch's revelation in Moses 7, verse 51, where the Lord covenanted with Enoch and sware unto him with an oath that he would stay the floods and that he would call upon the children of Noah. In light of this evidence, verse 21 of chapter 9 might be modified to read, and he drank of the wine and was in a vision and was uncovered within the tent of the Lord.
Mm. Drunk with the wine of the Lord.
Or that they were doing ordinate,
Right.
a sacred solemn assembly setting that precipitated this is my Bradshaw saying that, yeah, okay, the wine led to the vision, but didn't emphasize. My emphasis is that what is the state that he's in, that he's helpless, was
Right.
the result of being in the presence of God and not the wine.
Right. No, I could get behind that too.
I think that's the best way to understand this that I've ever come across.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense
But
too.
I am leapfrogging off of him and Nibley. He also says that there's possibility in Ham's wrongdoing that it consisted in his having approached without authorization the inner curtains of the sacred tent where Noah was enwrapped in vision. Some ancient traditions viewed Ham's actions as a part of an effort to steal Noah's priesthood garment and undermine his authority, which I support. Nibley argues from the interpretations of some ancient readers that the Hebrew term for nakedness in this verse, because the rabbis would interpret the nakedness and that Ham discovered his father's nakedness as being like that there was a sexual crime committed. But Nibley's saying that the word urwat may be better rendered as skins, orot. So urwat or
Oh, okay.
orot. In other words, an animal skin garment corresponding in this instance with a coat of skins given to Adam and Eve, which symbolically we discussed
Right.
fits the temple motif.
Right.
So I'm all for that. The Babylonian Talmud, which is also rabbinical, supports this. It says, the tunic that the Holy One, blessed be his name, made for Adam and his wife was with Noah in the ark. And when they left the ark, Ham, the son of Noah, took it and left with it and then passed it on to Nimrod. And I didn't look up the source because they didn't give me an exact source, but they gave me a date. But it said, Bradshaw says that Heber C. Kimball also says that Ham took clothing off of Noah.
Interesting.
And so that might be in the Journal of Discourses. It didn't cite that. It just gave a date for when he said that. It's January 11th, 1857.
So not so much a sexual thing as it is
It's a temple setting, and
and
Noah is incapacitated from his vision.
and Ham wants authority, so he's going to take the garment.
So yeah,
Yeah.
in a state of opportunity.
Right.
Uh, there's a scholar, Michael Morales, uh, writes in one of his books, which was fairly interesting to me. He says, as the righteous man, Noah not only passes through the door of the ark sanctuary, but is able to approach the mount of the Lord for worship. As the priestly figure able to ascend the mountain of the Lord, Noah stands as a new Adam, the primordial man who dwells in the divine presence. In Latin, Homo liturgicus. As such, he foreshadows the high priest of the tabernacle cultus, who alone will enter the paradisiacal holy of holies. So this is also a prefigure for the high priest
Right.
role, right? And so it seems that something is wrong with Ham entering the tent, and nothing is wrong with Shem and Japheth doing so. Some have postulated, like we said, that Noah had crimes committed against him, but it could be that Ham was simply disqualified from entering the temple at this point. and made a bid to obtain a symbol of his lost priesthood authority by taking a garment or robes of the priesthood from Noah, so others could fain claim it
Okay.
from Noah through Ham, which supports that's my analysis of this version of the story.
Right.
Because the Book of Abraham does say that the Egyptians would fain claim the priesthood through from Noah through Ham, and this line of thinking seems to streamline how that could be.
Right. Right. No. Yeah.
And further illustrating that too is illustrating the idea that the tent is a temple is that Noah's declaration that Japheth and Shem shall dwell together in the same tent, and Canaan shall not be there.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
We have one or two more sections, not nearly as long as those.
No, this has been good, dude. I'm having a blast.
Yeah, that was my favorite part of like all the temple stuff of
Oh yeah, it's just the temple motif over and over again,
yeah,
right?
in the most least likely place to find
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. But it fits.
It does.
It should be there
Mhm.
because it's a renewal of creation.
I was on Facebook when I found out that this is so I shouldn't admit this, but yeah, I was just scrolling and some video came up that describes Ugnashpatim's ark being a cube. And I was like, I need to look into that right now because I understood that the Holy of Holies anciently was a cube.
Up come the bed covers, kiss your wife goodnight, and then
Bye
off you
bye.
went. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know exactly how that happened, but I just knew something was there. And it was like just big unpacking when I started looking into it. And especially with the Aya speaking to him through the veil
Yeah.
and using a temple to build it.
It's just too much, but it should be there, right? Because, and this may lend credence to what Joseph Smith was talking about a world versus a planet, right? Because this is essentially kind of a new creation.
It is, and it's symbolic with the New
Right?
Jerusalem coming down
Yeah.
again. You know, if you're looking at the parallels, not so much of because it's hidden with Noah's Ark because the shape is wrong, but when you realize that there was this imagery in the ancient world, and John is drawing on that
Yeah.
for the next new world, the new
Yep.
heavens and the new earth,
Yeah.
it's huge.
Yeah. And just like we were alluding to earlier, where Genesis was a temple text, right? Okay, so that's at the first round of creation.
And so, yeah, it also
You
begs you to ask what's happening with Adam when he comes here too.
right. Absolutely. Absolutely it does, right? Again, the word replenish, right?
Yeah.
That's it doesn't really quite fit if he is, quote, the first person to ever inhabit the sphere.
Mhm.
But likewise, where Genesis, those early chapters of Genesis is a temple motif. Well, if God's kind of restarting it again, you would expect another temple motif
Yeah, you would.
to be present. And so it does fit very nicely into that.
It also fits with the consistent themes we've seen throughout our history, from the beginning to now, but even in a microcosm, the restored gospel of apostasy
Right.
and restoring the temple. Things get
Right.
taken from the temple, and the temple needs to come back
Yep.
every single time.
Yeah.
That's also what I draw.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, right? They land, and it seems to be that they're either involved in ordinances or a solemn assembly of some sort.
Yeah, and back to the people using Enoch as a scripture, they were saying the priesthood in Jerusalem's apostate, and we believe that we have access to a higher priesthood, and we're waiting for it to be set in order. We're waiting for this Melchizedek priest. We call him Christ,
Right.
But whatever, the motif's the same. And fundamentalists did the same thing with the one mighty and strong.
Yeah, they did.
And so I'm just going to leave that there. But
Yep. No, we did. We absolutely did.
But then we didn't do nothing about restoring the temple.
Not for a while.
No. Some wanted to, though. I know that Joseph Musser wanted to before he died. So not as fun as the last stuff, but there's some Jaredite connections. We'll probably talk more about the Jaredites in the next lesson because we're getting into Babel.
Right.
And the Great Tower stuff. But Nibley, in support of the Book of Mormon, draws parallels. For example, how uh, we have the Jaredite colony coming over through a flood, and they're led. They come with 8 arcs, while the ark had 8 people, and they had 8 stones or 16 stones, and that were given divine light. But also there are Babylonian, I think it's Babylonian. Anyway, 'cause there's like Midrash or Talmudic stuff that Noah had stones to give them light in the ark.
Right. Oh, okay.
Which and so presupposes the idea that the
Ooh,
brother of Jared got the idea, not in a vacuum, but
right.
knowing that what they were doing, redid the Noah thing
Absolute.
to
Whoa.
use these stones to facilitate the
So
divine
he's
light.
drawing on his predecessor, so to speak.
Yeah, and there are those myths in
Interesting.
the Jewish literature that, and Josephus even talks about it, I believe. And further temple themes regarding the stones
Yes.
are that so there was 8 times 2 because there's 8 arcs in the Jaredite colony times 2 gets
16.
you to 16. The high priest in Israel had 16 stones on the Urim and Thummim. So you had 12 on the breastplate,
Right.
you had two, one on each shoulder,
Yep.
and then you had 2 under the breastplate.
Right. 16.
16.
Sure, it's a coincidence.
Sure, it's a coincidence. So consistent symbolism
All the way.
all the way through.
Yep.
Yeah. Um, this is also a fun little proof text for fundamentalism and the gospel existing outside of certain structures too. Nibley says in his book Lehi in the Desert and World of the Jaredites, he says every century sees its wars, treaties, migrations, and so forth, but it's always a different setting. So that the test of a historical document lies, as we have so often insisted, not in the story it tells, but in the casual details that only eyewitnesses could have seen. The story of Jared and the story of Lehi have the same theme, the familiar one of the righteous man who leads his people out of a doomed and wicked world. There is nothing original in that. It is also the story of Noah, Enoch, Abraham, and Moses. The church in the wilderness, and for that matter, the restored church.
Mm.
Wow. So the idea that a church in the wilderness or in exile, that's its own motif that's
Yeah, it is.
consistently throughout scripture.
It absolutely is. Yep.
Abraham leaving his family, which was an
Yep.
apostate priesthood. Terah, in fact, means priest.
Yep.
Um, and he's a vagabond and a
Yep.
wanderer, has to resort to primitive temples. Moses coming out of Egypt,
Alma the Elder.
Alma the Elder gathering out of the city of Nephi to the land of the waters of Mormon.
Yep. Yep.
Yep, all the way through. John the
Baptist.
Baptist.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's where I was going next. Yeah.
who was in line perhaps with these Essenes and Qumran people, these Enochian,
Right.
uh, centric priesthood people.
Right.
John's focused on
And in
or
fact,
associated
there's
with.
some Essenes who put John the Baptist at a higher level
Yeah,
than even Jesus, right?
Right,
Don't
right.
agree with that.
I don't
but-
either. And so did the Manichaeans or the
Right. Yep.
if it's not them, it's the Mandaeans. I can't remember which one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm.
So interesting. So we set the framework for the next conversation already with the old world, new world
Right.
motifs. We talked about multiple use worlds. I
Yep.
think we've talked about it on other podcasts. I don't know how much we need to go back into that. But Christ says in the book of Luke, chapter 17, verse 26, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith took that and said, in the days of Noah, God destroyed the world by a flood, and he has promised to destroy it by fire in the last days. But before it should take place, Elijah should first come and turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. So, why is that important? Because the Elijah element in Malachi's promise is the temple.
Right.
The temple theme is prevalent in this renewal.
All the way through.
And
Yep.
without that, it couldn't be renewed.
No.
after this destruction. So that makes complete sense because you got this temple theme right after the flood, the New Jerusalem, and in Eden after that creation. So without Elijah restoring the temple, there's no new creation after
Mm,
the destruction.
interesting.
Hugh Nibley says in a book I have called Ancient Documents and the Pearl of Great Price, and also another article he wrote called Treasures in the Heavens. He talks about this Malachi's promise, baptism of fire motif. He says at a new creation, there is a reshuffling of elements. Incidentally, that's a quotation. The last one, that's from Ben Sirach. That's a book I haven't read, but it's on my list. It's one of the apocryphal
Okay.
books. He says it's one of the most old and venerable and universally accepted of all writings. It belongs in the Bible. It's in the Odes of Solomon. It's in the Ginza manuscript. It's in the Mandaean Johannes book, which means that's the Mandaean book of John. It's in the Berlin Manichaean. It's in the Pistis Sophia, the oldest and best of all the Coptic writings. At a new creation, there is a reshuffling of elements. That's what you would expect, like the rearranging of notes in the musical scale to make a new composition. It has even been suggested, as we have noted, that old worlds may be dismantled to supply stuff for the making of newer and better ones.
Mm.
That's the one where you get the storm that's mixed up.
Ooh.
The Jewish and apocryphal writers envisage a process by which the stuff of old worlds is alternately organized into new stars and planets. And when these have served their time, they're scrapped and decontaminated and reused in yet more new worlds. As we know today, this world wouldn't exist if a star hadn't exploded. It had to explode after it had gone through its life cycle and done all the pretty things it should do. Bam! And it was blown to smithereens. That alone produced the heavy elements that are necessary to make a world like this. So, as one world completes its cycle, the whole thing has to be recycled again into a new one, and then it goes through the same process again.
Wow.
Yeah,
And who said that?
that was Nibley.
Nice.
And so,
Nice.
yeah, on a big level, you'd have the cosmic destruction of the planetary body that can be reused. But I also think that without the body being destroyed, you can have
Yeah.
cataclysms,
Yep.
catastrophes that leave the earth in a state that is described in the Book of Abraham as desolate and without inhabitant,
Right.
and where a new Adam has to come.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And so we're told, I know I've talked about this before on the podcast, but I can't emphasize it enough. Without the priesthood restored by Elijah to bind us to the promises made to the fathers, which is everything that Joseph Smith restored, every
Yep.
doctrine restored, we would be left without root or branch
Yeah.
after that baptism of fire. Now, the church thinks that that's just they're safe as houses because we have the temples, we follow the prophet, and all the work is being done. But if you've changed the ordinances, none of that's efficacious.
Right.
And so that puts Malachi's promise or prophecy in a hugely more elevated stance in my book than is typically taken by the average person, I think.
Right.
But truly, without fulfilling the conditions, we're left, as Malachi says, it would be the world would be utterly wasted at the coming of the Lord.
So I'm going to say something else here with the spirit of Elijah. And I want to say that as a general rule, right? Obviously there are people who maybe have been adopted, right? And can't really find many of their own blood relatives or whatever. But I think what else could be missing from the mainstream model is this idea of going and getting your own names, doing the research, extracting those names, getting them ready.
Mm-hmm.
Because something does happen in that process. When you just show up, grab a name, go to work, I'm not sure that's
It's awful.
I'm
It's
not
so
sure that's
impersonal.
fulfilling that promise of Elijah. Now I get it. There are some people whose family records are just trashed, right?
Oh, sure.
I get it. And I'm sure the Lord wants you there regardless, right? Come grab a name from somebody else. But in today's day and age, I think that's getting less and less frequent.
Uh-huh.
I mean, look, I got some complicated family history.
Sure.
And just recently, things were it seems to be a wall that was blown up, and
The path is more clear.
yeah, it's
Sure.
more clear now. And so, but don't miss out on that part, right? I mean, that's an important part that I feel like gets glossed over sometimes.
It is. And so my bigger issue is just the fact that covenants and ordinances have
Right.
changed.
Me too.
And it seems that that's a super big problem in the grand historical overview.
Seems to be the same thing over and over.
It seems to be the same thing over and over again. Um, a focus on the promises originally made to us on this for our sake on behalf of who our fathers were. To me, it's less about doing all the work for your ancestors as much as obtain the blessings of the faithful fathers like Abraham for
Yep.
you and for your children,
Hmm.
and then you'll be grafted in. And that does take more ordinances. That is largely more a mystery in Mormonism as far as the law of adoption goes. But there is that option.
Right.
It's not like you're damned if you don't know where you come from.
Right.
There are ordinances to take care of you.
Right. Yep.
You can be fully adopted into the total royal family of the gods.
Absolutely.
And the gods are looking over us. We put this in terms. We don't look at it eternally enough, I don't think. It's just like, yeah, this is God's world. But when you take it more in a temple view, especially concerning genealogy, and realizing that God didn't just pop out of nowhere, but
Right.
He's got a genealogy, and you are the inheritor of that,
Yeah.
and that you can't help but wonder when you start putting things in perspective that it's just not Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother looking after us. It's
No.
all the gods in our line
Yep.
who look at us as the culmination of all the efforts that they have had so far. And they
Yep.
want us not only to come back into their presence, but they want us to increase
Yep.
the dominion, the power, the glory,
Yep.
extend it. And because without us, their increase would be jeopardized.
Yeah. Whew, that's
So,
a different perspective, isn't it?
so they are rooting for us.
Yeah. Yeah. We just got to put in the work.
So if you can't, and this is hard even for me because I'm preaching this, but like it's hard for me to even imagine this because honestly, I feel like the devil's winning a lot of the time lately.
Right.
But if we got one, I mean, depending on how you break that down, maybe there's more than one. But there's a lot more gods in heaven pulling for
Yeah.
us on our side of the corner. That should be motivating.
It should be. It should be. It's just for whatever reason we're enticed by the other side.
Yeah.
Um, more frequently than what we care to admit, and I think it's getting worse. Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. No. Well, dude, that's beautiful stuff.
Thank you.
So on to the next one.
On to the next one. We'll do Tower of Babel.
Awesome. Dude, I got some stuff on that. That will be good. I
Oh,
can't wait.
cool, cool, cool.
So, all right. Bye, everybody.